Jon Snow stood in the courtyard of Winterfell, the chill of dawn pressing like a cold hand against his skin. The castle was still, its ancient stones seeming to hold their breath beneath the gray sky. He was alone, or so he thought, until Ghost emerged from the shadows by the stables, white fur nearly indistinguishable from the thin crust of fresh snow. Jon placed a gloved hand on the direwolf's head, and Ghost's crimson eyes slid closed in silent approval. It was rare for Winterfell to lie so quiet. Even in winter, the castle usually bustled with the movement of servants tending fires, stable hands hauling feed, and watchmen pacing the battlements. But that morning felt different, as though the wind carried a hush of possibility, an omen cloaked in ice. He turned from the courtyard and followed Ghost through the old corridors, each step echoing in the corridor's vaulted expanse. Torches sputtered in their sconces, casting weak, wavering light along the walls. Ever since he had returned to Winterfell, he had tried to reacquaint himself with every nook and cranny. It had been his childhood home, yet he had never fully believed it was truly his. That disquiet nagged at him still, even after he was proclaimed king in the north. Another man might have worn the title with pride, but Jon had accepted it with a heavy sense of duty. And though the northerners hailed him as their king, he often wondered if the seat belonged to someone else, perhaps to his sister Sansa, or even Arya or Bran. But he was here now, and he was needed. He left Ghost in the corridor and passed through a narrow archway leading to a portion of Winterfell seldom used. The crypts. The flickering torch he carried sputtered in protest, the cold air swirling around him as though the spirits of his ancestors crowded close. Dust and darkness made the stairs treacherous, but he took them one at a time, determined to find whatever resolution he sought. Jon had come to these crypts often after discovering truths about his parentage. He did not come this time in search of answers, exactly. Instead, it was more of a pull, an urge that had been building in him for days. His boots scraped across ancient stone, and he paused at the base of the steps. The crypt loomed, heavy with centuries of stark history. Columns carved into the likeness of direwolves watched him with sightless eyes, and the faint silhouettes of old sarcophagi lined the walls. Ned Stark's statue stood with an air of gentle solemnity. The secrets he had kept in life cast echoes in Jon's mind. He had thought perhaps in the silence of the crypt, he might find a sense of direction, or at least unburden some of the questions that weighed on his soul. He approached Ned's statue slowly, allowing his eyes to wander over its carved face. The chiseling was rough, lacking the hand of a truly skilled artisan, but the features reminded Jon of the man who had raised him. He whispered, "Father," and though he knew the truth now, that Rhaegar Targaryen had sired him, he still felt every bit Ned Stark's son at heart. The question that burned in him was not just about lineage. It was about destiny. He had learned that Daenerys Targaryen flew her dragons south, that the White Walkers advanced from beyond the wall. Winter was here, and with winter came fear. He sighed, turning from the statue to venture deeper along the corridor. His torch revealed a passage he'd only half recalled from childhood, a disused section behind some of the older tombs. Perhaps it was the sense of isolation or the promise of discovering something hidden, but he found himself slipping through an arched doorway covered in cobwebs. Shards of stone, half buried in dust, crunched beneath his boots. The temperature dropped further until he could see each breath as a swirl of vapor. A single chamber lay at the end of this corridor, small and cramped with a low ceiling. It smelled of damp earth and centuries of neglect. He was about to turn back, feeling almost foolish for trespassing in such a forgotten place, when his eyes caught a dull gleam of something in the corner. Carefully, he lifted the torch, and there on the ground was a structure that looked almost like a chest. Though rotted by time, its hinges and metal fastenings remained intact. The top had caved in, revealing a tangle of cloth or leather within. Gently, Jon crouched and poked through the debris until he uncovered something large, round, and covered in faint, crystalline ridges. At first, he thought it was a decorative stone, perhaps some relic of House Stark's past. But as he brushed away more dust, his heart began to thud. He had seen a dragon's egg once. Daenerys had shared stories of how her eggs had looked before they hatched. And though hers had been tinted with green and black and bronze, this one shimmered faintly like frost-laced glass. In the torchlight, icy hues glimmered across its surface. It felt cold to the touch, almost painfully so, yet Jon could not bring himself to pull his hand away. A dragon's egg, and not just any dragon's egg, one that seemed as if it had been forged from winter itself. A swirl of conflicting emotions washed over him. It felt impossible, akin to a child's tale from old Nan's stories, the legend of ice dragons that soared in the darkest winters, their breath as cold as death. He had always dismissed such creatures as myth. Now here he was, crouched in a dusty chamber of Winterfell, cradling an egg that seemed to throb with an otherworldly chill. Gingerly, he lifted it, surprised by its weight and the faint hum of power that vibrated in his palm. He set the torch aside, carefully placing it in a nearby sconce, and studied the egg. A creeping sense of awe overtook him, and the question in his mind was immediate: what was he to do with this? After all that had happened, his own resurrection, the revelation of his Targaryen blood, the war looming against the Night King. Fate now placed a fabled ice dragon's egg in his hands. Jon inhaled deeply, thinking of the responsibilities that lay upon his shoulders. If this egg hatched, would it become a monstrous creature of winter, an abomination set on destruction? Or could it be a weapon, a living hope for the North? He stood, dust drifting off his cloak, and made his way back through the crypt, the egg clutched protectively to his chest. It was madness, he told himself. But the others had to know. Sansa, Arya, Bran, and possibly even Samwell Tarly. Sam might have read of such a thing in the books he had taken from the Citadel. Yet every instinct told him to keep it hidden for now. If the White Walkers learned of its existence, if the realm discovered he possessed something so rare and potentially powerful, chaos would ensue. He decided he would show it only to those he trusted absolutely. For the next few days, the egg remained locked away in Jon's chambers, hidden in a sturdy trunk near his bed. He could hardly sleep at night, his mind whirling with uncertainty. Each time he dared open the trunk, he found the egg even colder to the touch, as if it absorbed the very warmth around it. Despite that chill, a pulse of life seemed to beat from within, faint but undeniable. On the third morning, he woke to a thin layer of frost coating the inside of the trunk. Sansa was the first to notice something amiss. She found Jon in the hallway, his hair still damp from the cold, early morning air, and asked why he seemed so distant. Her eyes had always been perceptive, shaped by hardship and tempered by her experiences in King's Landing. Yet Jon struggled with whether to confide in her. He led her to his room, locking the door behind them. She looked at him questioningly until he lifted the trunk's lid and revealed the crystalline egg. She stood transfixed, pale fingers resting on her lips. "It can't be," she murmured. The concept of dragons, even Targaryen dragons, was difficult enough to grasp, but an ice dragon egg hidden beneath Winterfell for centuries was beyond belief. She reached out, hovering her hand over the shell. "It's so cold. Can it truly be alive?" Jon nodded. "It feels like there's something inside, a heartbeat, something faint, but real." Sansa's eyes darted from the egg to Jon. She knew as well as he did that dragons were more than mythical beasts. They were symbols of power, objects of fear. And if this was indeed an ice dragon egg, it might shift the balance of everything they knew. "What do you plan to do?" she asked, voice trembling just slightly. "I'm not sure," Jon admitted. "We can't let the secret slip. Not yet. But we need to see if there's a way to hatch it, or if we even should." His words hung in the cold air. Hatching a dragon typically required intense heat. Daenerys had used a funeral pyre to bring her dragons into the world. But what if an ice dragon required the opposite? The question was almost absurd. Yet here it was, solid in front of them. Sansa's face hardened with that pragmatic determination she had adopted since reclaiming Winterfell. "We should speak to Bran and Sam. They'll know more about this than we do. But carefully. We can't let the Lords of the North or anyone else catch wind of this yet." Jon agreed. That night, they convened in Bran's solar, a small chamber warmed by a single brazier. Bran was seated by the window, his faraway gaze reminding Jon always that his younger brother carried knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. The three-eyed raven's mantle weighed heavily on him. Sam stood nearby, fussing with a stack of tomes he had smuggled out of the Citadel. Jon revealed the egg. Bran's eyes seemed to cloud over as if he peered somewhere else, somewhere distant. Sam gasped, adjusting his spectacles and leaning in to examine the shell's frosty ridges. He began flipping through pages of a thick, leather-bound volume, muttering about legends and old ballads. At length, he found a passage that spoke of a being called Hracker, the first ice, an ancient being rumored to have once soared over the lands of always winter. The text said that only a Stark of Winterfell could discover the egg if winter truly needed it. The words were riddled with half-truths and allusions, but the gist was unmistakable. The timing, now that the Night King threatened the realm, could not be coincidence. Bran, in a quiet voice that trembled with both fear and fascination, said, "I've seen glimpses in my visions." There was a shape of white in the sky, larger than any bird. Its roar froze rivers. People fled, thinking it was a demon. But it was bound to the ancient blood of the north somehow. It was not the same as the dragons of Valyria. It was something else, something older. At that, Jon found himself leaning forward, the weight of destiny pressing on him like a mailed glove. How do we hatch it? Sam wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. There are no direct accounts of anyone hatching an ice dragon. Every record says that if ice dragons did exist, they were never tamed. But if they could be hatched, it wouldn't be with fire. The legends speak of a cold so intense it can freeze flame. Perhaps it needs the bitter cold. True winter. Magic. A Stark's presence. They all stared at one another, the enormity of the possibility thrumming in the silence. Winterfell was built over hot springs, the reason it stayed warm and the reason even the harshest snowstorms failed to freeze it solid. If the egg required unrelenting cold, Winterfell might be the least ideal place to nurture it. Bran, however, quickly offered a solution. The crypts go deep. There are places where the natural heat doesn't reach. Ice lingers year-round in some of the lower tunnels. Perhaps that is where it must be kept. You are the one who found it, Jon. It likely responds to you. Jon wanted to protest. He had enough burdens, leading the north, preparing for the wars to come, grappling with his parentage. And now this. But he understood that some duties chose you rather than the other way around. With quiet resolve, they devised a plan. Jon would make nightly trips deep into the crypt, carefully carrying the egg to a chamber Bran identified through his visions. Sam would read every record he could find, searching for any clues about the process. Sansa would maintain the secrecy above ground, ensuring no talk of an egg or a mythical ice dragon escaped the castle walls. If this was truly to be the North's best chance against the undead onslaught, then the fewer who knew, the better. Over the next weeks, the hush around Winterfell took on a new meaning. Jon performed his duties as king in the north by day, meeting with lords, sending ravens south, organizing the defenses, while each night he slipped into the crypt armed with torches and a cloak lined with fur. The egg began to respond to the deeper chill the further he ventured below the castle. It glowed faintly in the dark, a pale blue luminescence that seemed to shimmer in rhythmic pulses. At times, Jon swore he heard a thin, crackling noise from within, like the slow grind of ice forming on a winter lake. He would kneel there, in the deep gloom, the torchlight flickering on damp walls, and whisper ancient prayers he scarcely knew he remembered. Words from the old gods, bits of the half-forgotten prayers old Nan had taught him, and even some from the Seven. In truth, he wasn't sure which gods might listen, but he prayed all the same, praying for guidance, praying for the strength to do what must be done, praying that if this was truly a second chance for the world, it would not slip through his fingers. As the weeks wore on, the realm's winter grew harsher. Snow fell in thick blankets. The winds whistled through Winterfell's towers, howling like wolves. The White Walkers made their steady advance, and tension soared. Word reached Jon that Daenerys and her armies fought desperately in the south, attempting to unite the lords there to the cause, but suspicion and old enmities hampered her efforts. Jon could not leave the north. He had to stand firm to unite the bannermen he could trust and to keep his people safe. Meanwhile, the egg continued its silent transformation in the crypt. Then, one particularly cold night, when the wind rattled the shutters so hard they threatened to tear loose, Jon woke with a start. A chill like death's hand pressed against his chest. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, a layer of frost coating his breath. The hearth fire in his room was out, snuffed by a sudden wave of cold. He realized the egg was calling to him. Without waiting, he threw on his cloak and boots and dashed down the corridors, paying no heed to the hushed questions of the guards or the swirling snow drifting through the halls. Torch in hand, he sprinted down to the crypt, ghost at his side, the direwolf's hackles raised. He found the egg glowing like a pale star in the gloom. Thin cracks spidered across its surface, glinting in patterns reminiscent of frost-laced windows. Jon's breath caught. It was hatching. A faint hum, more felt than heard, resonated through the air. The torchlight flickered wildly, and Ghost let out a low growl. Jon knelt. He reached out, not entirely sure if it was wise or safe. but guided by instinct. The chill around the egg intensified, making the torch gutter. Light radiated from the cracks, and then, with a high-pitched crack, a piece of the shell splintered away. A thin, otherworldly screech sliced through the crypt. Jon's heart hammered as he glimpsed movement within. Something white and glistening, steam curling off it like the breath of a snowstorm. The hatchling emerged slowly, its scales a milky translucence that shimmered under the torchlight. Jagged ridges crowned its head. It blinked once with eyes as pale as a moonlit glacier. Small as it was, hardly larger than a cat, a sense of raw power emanated from its tiny body. It raised its head and let out a breath, which crystallized the air, frost gathering across the stone floor. Jon extended a trembling hand. The hatchling cocked its head, uncertain. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, it pressed its snout against his palm, leaving a thin patch of ice on his glove. He could feel its heart, an odd, cold pulse that beat against his own. He exhaled in wonder. An ice dragon, newly hatched, looking upon him as if he were the only warmth in the world. A hush settled over them, broken only by the distant moan of the wind through Winterfell's crypts. He gathered the hatchling gently, its scales chilling his arms through his cloak. It felt fragile, yet he suspected it held within it unimaginable potential. The question was no longer if it could be hatched, but how to nurture it, train it, prepare it to stand against the dead. He whispered soothing words to the creature, and it blinked again, curling its tail around his wrist. In that moment, Jon felt a quiet resolve. If the White Walkers threatened to turn the entire realm into a frozen grave, then an ice dragon, bound to the north, might be the very edge they needed. Within the next day, the secret could not remain hidden from the small circle who had conspired with Jon. Bran, Sansa, Arya, and Sam all gathered to see the hatchling. Bran's eyes were wide, though his composure remained eerily calm. Arya stared in wonder, her normally guarded expression betraying a flicker of childlike awe. Sansa looked on, pressing her hand to her mouth again, as if she could hardly believe the creature was real. Sam, stuttering, began spouting every snippet of lore he had read about mythical winter serpents. The hatchling responded to none but Jon, though it allowed each of the others to approach with cautious curiosity. Occasionally it would release a puff of cold breath, freezing a patch of stone or leaving frost on someone's fingertips. Jon studied every subtle motion, learning how the dragon's power manifested. Its body radiated a cold that was not merely physical. There was something ethereal about it, as if it was woven from the very essence of winter. Yet it also seemed to crave Jon's presence, curling up beside him, taking comfort in his body heat which it would slowly leach away. Despite the stark contradiction of a cold beast seeking warmth, Jon felt a sense of kinship, as if they were two sides of the same coin. He was born a Targaryen, a house of fire, but raised a Stark, a family of ice. Now he held a being that embodied both darkness and cold, and it chose him as its guardian. They could not keep the hatchling in the crypt forever. Aside from being impractical, the rumor of strange growls or hisses in the night might spread. So they prepared an abandoned tower near the rear of Winterfell, one rarely visited due to its crumbling staircases and drafty walls. It was cold enough there, exposed to the biting wind, that the hatchling seemed content. Jon visited frequently, ensuring it was fed and protected. He hunted hares and small game, discovering that the hatchling preferred its meat frozen. Over time, it grew quickly, bones strengthening, wings broadening. Within weeks, it was as large as a medium-sized hound, able to glide short distances if it leaped from a high ledge. It remained docile around Jon, yet fiercely territorial when others approached. More than once, it pinned its crystalline gaze on would-be intruders, releasing a warning hiss that caused frost to creep across the floor. But it tolerated Sansa, Arya, Bran, Sam, and Ghost, accepting them as part of Jon's pack. With each passing day, Jon's bond with the creature deepened. He found that certain commands spoken softly caused it to respond, tilting its head or releasing a gentle plume of cold breath. For hours, Jon would sit with it, feeling the swirling synergy of ice and magic. He named it Hracker after the ancient name Sam had found in the tomes, a name that spoke to its primordial roots. Yet Horde of trouble drew ever closer. The dead advanced. When news finally reached Winterfell that the wall had been breached, brought down by the Night King, who now commanded an undead dragon, despair rippled through the north. Raven after raven arrived, detailing villages razed by whites, castles abandoned to snow and fear. The time for secrecy grew short. Jon summoned his bannermen and allies to prepare for the final confrontation. He knew that soon the presence of an ice dragon would be impossible to conceal. But he hoped that when it was revealed it might inspire more awe than terror, and if it brought them victory, so be it. Daenerys, upon hearing of the breach, made haste to march her armies north. She arrived at Winterfell's gates in a swirl of snow, 2 living dragons soaring overhead. Jon met her in the courtyard, tension swirling between them. They still shared a bond complicated by the revelation of Jon's Targaryen heritage and overshadowed by the pressing war. Her dragons roared, their hot breath melting patches of snow around them. Soldiers cowered at the sound, while northerners muttered under their breath about Targaryen madness. Yet Daenerys stood regal, determined, telling Jon that her forces would fight alongside him until the threat was ended. He led her to the hidden tower in the evening when the last rays of sun stretched across Winterfell's ramparts. Hracker waited in the shadows, curled around itself, ice crystals shimmering along its scaled back. Daenerys' eyes widened at the sight. "What is this?" Jon explained, voice hushed with a mixture of reverence and worry. She reached out a hand only to snatch it back when the dragon hissed a warning. Her expression flickered from shock to curiosity to a hint of awe. "An ice dragon," she whispered. "I never thought." She watched it for a long moment, her own dragons roaring distantly from their roost. "When I birthed my dragons in fire and blood, I believed they were the only ones in this world. This changes things." "It might be the key to defeating the Night King," Jon said. "The White Walkers wield the power of ice, but this dragon is no thrall of theirs. It's an embodiment of the North itself. If we can unite the powers of fire and ice, perhaps we stand a chance." Daenerys nodded, though her gaze lingered on Hracker with mingled fascination and unease. She recognized in it a cousin to her own children, yet alien. She said softly, "We must be cautious, Jon. A dragon's loyalty can be fickle if not nurtured with care." And nurture it Jon did. In the days that followed, Winterfell became the epicenter of frantic preparation. Armies camped outside the walls, forging weapons of dragonglass, assembling catapults, building trenches. Daenerys' dragons circled overhead, their roars echoing across the fields. And each night, Jon ascended the broken tower, checking on Hracker. He brushed frost from its scales, fed it, tried to coax it into flying with him. At times, he felt a stir of the Targaryen fire in his blood, clashing with the ice in the dragon's breath. Perhaps he was the living embodiment of the Song of Ice and Fire, bridging 2 worlds in a final stand against oblivion. When the Night King's army finally came into view, cresting the horizon under a deathly quiet sky, a chill deeper than any winter wind swept over the assembled defenders. Tens of thousands of whites, their dead eyes luminous in the dusk, stretched into the distance. Overhead, the rotting silhouette of the undead dragon soared with the Night King astride it, trailing an aura of frozen darkness. The ground itself seemed to groan under the weight of that many dead. The defenders stood on the walls, hearts pounding. Torches burned bright, flickering in the wind. Archers manned their posts. War horns blared, a deep resonance that rattled the banners. Jon walked among the front lines, Ghost at his side, greeting the men and women who would stand and fight. He felt a sense of unity in that moment. Northmen, Vale Knights, free folk, Unsullied, Dothraki, and even some southern lords who had come at Daenerys' behest. They were all that stood between life and endless night. Night fell with a near-lunar glow on the snow. The White Walkers advanced slowly, an implacable tide of ice. Daenerys' dragons launched into the sky with piercing shrieks, belching flames that scorched the front ranks of whites. Soldiers rushed to meet the undead, steel clashing against rotting flesh. Screams filled the air, mingling with the roar of dragon fire. Above, the undead dragon bellowed, sending shards of freezing breath to the ground. Men died in droves, their flesh left black and frostbitten. Jon had prepared Hracker as best he could. The young ice dragon had grown significantly, large enough for Jon to mount in a rudimentary harness, though it was not as massive as Daenerys' dragons. Its white scales glowed under the moonlight, and its breath seemed to intensify in the presence of the dead. With a determined exhale, Jon climbed onto its back, wind whipping around him. Hracker leapt from the battlements, wings beating furiously. Despite the risk, Jon trusted in their bond. The descent into battle was both exhilarating and terrifying. They soared above the chaos, Hracker's frosty breath freezing entire swaths of whites, rendering them brittle so that a single blade or blunt force shattered them to pieces. The Night King, perched atop his undead dragon, regarded Hracker with cold, glowing eyes. Jon felt the gaze pierce him, a silent challenge. Ice against ice. Death against life. With a bellowing roar, the undead dragon unleashed its freezing torrent. Hracker answered, and where their breaths collided in midair, a violent storm of ice shards exploded, stinging like daggers in the night. Jon felt the collision of powers reverberate through his body. He clutched Hracker's harness, urging the dragon higher, away from the lethal confrontation. The Night King pursued, driving the undead beast forward with inhuman strength. Below them, Winterfell's courtyard erupted in battle cries. Daenerys's dragons scorched more whites, but even their flames struggled against the endless tide of the dead. The defenders stood resolute, battered by the icy wind, pressed by unrelenting hordes. Hracker spun in the air, wings cutting through the frigid night. Jon guided it toward the undead dragon, bracing himself as they collided with a thunderous crash. Scales scraped against frozen flesh. The undead dragon snapped its jaws, serrated teeth aiming to tear through Hracker's neck. But the ice dragon twisted gracefully, unleashing a burst of sub-zero breath that cracked the undead scales. Jon gripped his sword, long claw, as frost formed on its hilt. He knew that Valyrian steel was capable of killing White Walkers, but this was a different challenge, a monstrous dragon reanimated by the Night King. Below, the battle raged. The White Walkers themselves strode calmly through the carnage, each one an agent of death. Bran, safely hidden away in the godwood, warged into ravens, sending them to harass the enemy. Arya flitted through the battlefield like a shadow, dispatching whites with lethal precision. Sansa directed logistical efforts from the walls, ensuring ammunition and reinforcements were placed where needed. Daenerys soared on Drogon's back, igniting pockets of the undead. Even so, it was a desperate fight. Midair, the Night King raised his spear of ice, eyes fixed on Hracker. Jon's heart lurched. He recalled how a single throw had felled Viserion before. He spurred Hracker with urgency, diving to avoid the javelin. The air hissed as the spear shot past, grazing Hracker's flank. The dragon snarled in pain, but pressed on, wings beating. Jon felt his mount's fury as much as his own terror. The young ice dragon whipped its tail, smashing it into the undead dragon's side. Bones cracked under the impact. A haunting shriek of rage erupted from the abomination. The Night King looked almost impassive, but Jon sensed the malevolence burning behind those frozen eyes. He circled again, launching another spear. This time Hracker banked hard, but the spear grazed Jon's thigh, ripping through cloth and flesh. Pain flared, hot despite the cold. Blood soaked Jon's pants, but he held firm, refusing to yield. With a roar that seemed both of man and dragon, Jon urged Hracker forward, smashing into the undead dragon with the full force of their combined momentum. Scales cracked. Hracker's breath coated the undead dragon's head in a thick layer of ice. Seizing the moment, Jon heaved Longclaw forward. The blade pierced the frozen skull of the beast, a thunderous crack echoing in the night sky. A rush of black, decaying essence spewed from the wound, scattering like shards of glass. The undead dragon jerked violently before collapsing in midair, its reanimated magic unraveling. The Night King plummeted, falling from the disintegrating creature. Jon and Hracker spiraled in the whipping wind, battered by the shockwave, nearly colliding with the castle walls. But they steadied themselves, landing heavily in the courtyard with a jarring thud. Jon rolled off Hracker, his wounded leg buckling. He forced himself upright as men and women fought desperately around him. The whites pressed in from all sides, but he caught sight of the Night King striding across the courtyard, reaching for a dead soldier's sword. Their gazes locked, and Jon felt the cold of endless night seep into his bones. This was the final confrontation they had long dreaded. He raised Longclaw, ignoring the screaming pain in his thigh. Hracker, beside him, snarled at the monstrous figure that threatened to bring about the end of all life. The Night King stepped forward, silent. Jon braced, preparing for a clash that might well claim his life. But at that moment, Hracker unleashed a roar so powerful it shook the very walls of Winterfell. The air crystallized around the Night King's form, slowing him, encasing him in a sheath of frost. Jon took his chance. With a cry of rage and desperation, he swung Longclaw. The Valyrian steel blade, singing in the frozen air, shattered the icy prison and found its mark. The Night King's body cracked like fragile glass, a shriek echoing through the courtyard as the dark magic binding him together was torn asunder. In a flurry of ice and howling wind, the Night King disintegrated, his malevolent presence vanishing. Across the battlefield, every white and White Walker collapsed into inert corpses or heaps of ice crystals. Daenerys's dragons roared triumph. Soldiers blinked in awe, weapons still raised against an enemy that no longer moved. For a long moment, there was only stunned silence. Then came the cheers. A roar of victory spread across Winterfell, men and women falling to their knees in gratitude. Jon sank to the ground, exhaustion overwhelming him. Hracker lowered its head, ice blue eyes meeting Jon's. The dragon's breath ghosted across his armor, forming a thin layer of frost, but he felt only relief and triumph. Ghost bounded over, whining softly, pressing his nose against Jon's shoulder. Daenerys landed nearby, dismounting Drogon with tears of relief in her eyes. She hurried to Jon, cradling his face in her hands, the warmth of her breath a reminder that they had not perished in the cold night. In the days that followed, Winterfell tended to its wounded. Pyres were lit to honor the fallen. Though battered and bruised, the living had triumphed over the dead. The lords of the north hailed Jon Snow again, their king who had led them to victory. Songs began to spread about the ice dragon of Winterfell, how it had aided in slaying the Night King, forging a new legend for the north. Word traveled swiftly, and men spoke of an alliance of fire and ice that had saved the realm from eternal darkness. Hracker remained at Winterfell, growing day by day. Jon nursed his leg wound, though it left a scar that throbbed on cold nights. And each evening he would stand on the walls, looking out over the snowy fields where the final battle had been fought. He would watch Hracker glide overhead, a speck of white against a sky of shimmering stars. Sometimes it would release a triumphant cry, as if calling to the old gods themselves. The North had its dragon now, a guardian woven from ice and bound by loyalty to House Stark's blood. Daenerys stayed for a time, overseeing repairs and establishing a pact between the North and any southern kingdom wise enough to respect its sovereignty. Tensions and politics still lingered, but a certain awe tempered them. The old hatreds that once seemed insurmountable were softened by the memory of the living uniting against the dead. The presence of Daenerys's dragons and Jon's ice dragon served as a potent reminder of the power that once nearly broke the world and the alliance that had saved it. As the cold months passed, it became clear that winter's harshest fury was spent, thanks to the removal of the undead threat. Small signs of thaw appeared around Winterfell, trickles of water running off ramparts, a few green shoots forcing their way through the snow. And still, Hracker thrived in the chill. It would fly from Winterfell to the surrounding forests, returning with game clutched in its jaws. Jon would sometimes accompany it, marveling at the raw majesty of a creature unbound by the constraints of mortal men. He thought often of those who had fallen in the war. He thought of his father, both of them in a way. Ned Stark, who had given him love and honor, who had taught him that duty and family came before all else. Rhaegar Targaryen, whose legacy of fire ran through Jon's veins. The union of Stark and Targaryen blood had produced him, and here he was, forging an unlikely bond with a dragon of ice. It felt as if the old songs about the prince that was promised had been too narrow, only looking to drag on fire, never considering that winter might bear its own champion. One morning, after a night of strange dreams, Jon woke early and climbed the highest battlement of Winterfell. Hracker was perched there, talons gripping the stone, gazing at the horizon. Snow drifted around them, but the sky held a hint of dawn's light. Without speaking, Jon placed a hand on Hracker's flank. The dragon's cold presence vibrated through him. He thought of how precariously the realm had hung on the brink of annihilation and how, together, they had steered it toward hope. He closed his eyes, letting the wind sting his face. In that solitude, he realized that though there were battles yet to fight, political struggles, old grudges, the endless complexities of ruling, a great shadow had lifted from the world. The dawn seemed a little brighter than the day before. He recalled a line from some half-remembered book Sam had read to him. After the longest night, the day always comes. Perhaps the day had come, but it was up to those still living to preserve it. In the moons that followed, peace was tenuous but real. Daenerys returned south eventually, leaving a small garrison to remain allied with Jon and the north. Sansa continued as the Lady of Winterfell, commanding respect for her wisdom. Arya, restless as ever, departed to explore what lay west of Westeros, carrying with her the memory of the battle that had shaped their family's legacy. Bran remained at Winterfell, bound to the ancient weirwoods and the knowledge of ages. Sam traveled between Winterfell and Oldtown, continuing his studies and assisting Jon in forging a new era of cooperation. And Jon himself, king in the north, found strange comfort in the daily tasks of tending to his people, forging alliances, and ensuring that the newly won peace endured. Hracker grew to nearly the size of a small castle tower, shedding its juvenile awkwardness. Its scales took on a more pronounced crystalline pattern, refracting light so that rainbows danced across its hide whenever the sun struck it. Children in Winterfell would sometimes gather at the walls, hoping to catch a glimpse of the fabled ice dragon. Jon took care to keep it disciplined, ensuring no stray livestock or unfortunate traveler fell victim to a misplaced frosty breath. Over time, the people of the north came to accept Hracker as much as they accepted dire wolves or the presence of the hot springs beneath the castle. It was part of Winterfell's identity, a living testament to its resilience. Of course, not all were comfortable with this new power. Envoys from across the narrow sea, from the Iron Islands, and even Dorne arrived to witness the creature. Whispers spread of a new threat, a potential tyrant of the north. Jon dealt with them diplomatically but firmly. He had no intention of conquest, only defense. The Ice Dragon was for the realm's protection, as had been proven when it helped defeat the Night King. Gradually, though grudgingly, other kingdoms and lands accepted that Winterfell's bond with Hracker was not a sign of ambition but a bulwark against future threats. And yet, in quiet moments, Jon remembered the roar in the night sky, the confrontation with the Night King, the wave of cold that nearly stole his breath. He remembered how fragile life was, how victory had been snatched from the jaws of oblivion. The scars on his leg throbbed whenever he recalled that fateful spear. The memory of those lost friends, allies, even foes who had fallen in the war sat heavily on his heart. But perhaps it was the weight of those memories that kept him vigilant, determined to rule justly and to never let arrogance blind him to the dangers that lurked in the far corners of the world. Seasons turned, and though winter lingered longer than usual, it eventually began to recede. Soft rains replaced the endless snow. Fields near Winterfell saw patches of green. Even so, Hracker's presence ensured that a cool wind always seemed to blow around the castle, as if winter lived on in the singular, magical creature. Farmers adjusted, travelers marveled, and life carried on. Over time, Jon sensed the subtle shift in how people addressed him. Initially, he was the bastard of Winterfell, then Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, then King in the North. Now, increasingly, they spoke of him as a legend. Some songs even began calling him the Iceborn Dragon. It made him uncomfortable, for he knew his faults, his doubts, and the smallness of any single man's courage when set against the enormity of the world's perils. But he also recognized that legends had their uses. They could unite people, give them hope, instill a sense of purpose. If his bond with Hracker could help maintain that fragile peace, he would endure the songs. So he would stand on Winterfell's walls as twilight descended, looking over a land that had suffered so greatly yet still found a way to endure. And he would see Hracker circling above, silent and graceful, a sentinel carved from the purest winter snow. Occasionally, the dragon would alight on the battlements, letting Jon run a hand over its shimmering scales. There was a cool gentleness in Hracker's gaze, a reminder of the silent depths of winter, yet also a promise of protection. Sometimes Jon would murmur words of the old tongue, incantations he remembered from old Nan's stories, or simple thanks to the old gods for granting him this bond, this second chance to guard the realm. Memories of his father's words, when the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies but the pack survives, lingered in his mind. He understood now, more than ever, how people survived, by standing together against the dark, forging alliances that transcended old grudges and embracing the gifts fate offered, be they dire wolves or dragons of ice. And perhaps, he mused, that was the real victory. Not just slaying the Night King, but learning how to live after. The storm had passed. Months turned into years, the threat of the dead receding into half-remembered nightmares for most of the realm. Yet in the north, the memory was kept alive. Veterans told tales of the final battle, of the king who rode an ice dragon and destroyed the champion of death. Children grew up hearing songs of how winter's power had been turned against itself. The crypts of Winterfell gained a new statue in time, one of Jon Snow, carved with Hracker by his side, though Jon grumbled at the extravagance. Sansa insisted the story be remembered, that future generations understand the price that had been paid for their lives in the spring air. For Jon, life became a constant balancing act between duty and humility. He never quite grew used to being addressed with hushed reverence, but he accepted the responsibilities that came with leadership. He sought counsel with wise men and women. He listened to the needs of smallfolk. He traveled occasionally to the south to pay respects, forging alliances based on trade and mutual defense rather than subjugation. But always he returned to Winterfell, to his home, the fortress whose walls had sheltered his youth and his greatest battle. And Hracker was always there, a looming presence that dwarfed everything else on the castle grounds. Over the years, the dragon's hide grew thicker, the crystalline edges more pronounced, reflecting the starlight in prismatic flashes. On clear nights, one could see them circling above from miles away, a pale comet in the sky. When storms gathered, Hracker seemed energized, reveling in the crackle of ice and snow. Jon would often spend hours in the courtyard with the beast, marveling at how something so lethal could be so serene, how it recognized him and treated him with an almost Lupin affection. That bond remained a mystery to many. Even Daenerys, whose empathy with her own dragons was legendary, found it difficult to fully grasp. Some suggested that Jon's unique parentage, his Stark ancestry combined with Targaryen blood, allowed him to bridge the gap, a living testament to the union of fire and ice. Others claimed it was a favor from the old gods that the North itself had chosen him to guard it. Jon, however, preferred a simpler explanation: they had saved each other. When the egg had hatched in the deep crypts, Jon had given Hracker purpose. And when the final battle came, Hracker had returned the favor, carrying Jon into a conflict that neither could have won alone. That shared understanding, forged in the crucible of life and death, transcended anything mortal men could easily define. In this way, the North endured. Every so often, ominous rumors would arise: bandits in the mountains, airborne raids along the coast, petty lords plotting rebellion. Jon dealt with them firmly, yet always with an eye toward justice. The presence of an ice dragon was often deterrent enough, and few tested the king in the North who had once vanquished the embodiment of death itself. Though the realm's politics were ever-shifting, the quiet knowledge that beyond all squabbling, an alliance of men and dragons had saved humanity from annihilation prevented the worst excesses of ambition. As the years wore on, Jon grew older, lines of care marking his face, though he retained much of his strength. Hracker, for its part, continued to thrive, becoming a fixture of the northern skyline. On the anniversary of the Night King's defeat, the people of Winterfell lit lanterns, floating them into the sky as a sign of remembrance. One year, as those lanterns rose, Hracker soared among them, weaving through the glowing orbs in a silent dance that left everyone breathless. The scene etched itself into the realm's history, a moment where sorrow and hope mingled in a single tapestry of light. In quiet reflection, Jon sometimes wondered what would happen in future centuries. Would another winter come so fiercely that the undead rose again? Would the realm forget the threat, dismissing it as old stories while the powers of the dark crept anew? Perhaps. But he had done his part. He had kept his vows to defend the living against the horrors that lurked in the cold. If another threat ever arose, perhaps another champion would step forward, maybe even another ice dragon egg waiting to be discovered in the crypts of Winterfell. The North was old, older than memory, and within its bones lay countless secrets. For now, though, the land knew peace, and that was enough. Sometimes he remembered the first moment he found that frosty egg in the dust of the crypt, how impossibly small the seed of hope had seemed. He had held it, uncertain, burdened by a destiny he didn't fully understand. And yet, from that tiny shell, an unstoppable force had emerged, turning the tide against the greatest evil the realm had ever known. It reminded him of a lesson he had learned time and again. Hope could be found in the unlikeliest of places, like a solitary bastard boy in a castle of proud nobles or an ice dragon egg slumbering under centuries of stone. And so the days rolled on, each new dawn chasing the lingering ghosts of the long night. Winterfell remained a bastion of resilience, its hot springs still steaming, its walls standing strong. The lords of the North continued to gather in the Great Hall, and the memory of their victory over the dead remained a unifying anthem. Life found new rhythms, births and weddings bringing joy, funerals and farewells shadowing the halls with sadness, yet never overshadowing the knowledge that they had faced extinction and survived. Through it all, Jon Snow and Hracker, king in the North and the ice dragon of Winterfell, stood as sentinels. He wore the mantle of leadership with humble stoicism, relying on Sansa's counsel and Bran's insight, forging lasting friendships with those who once doubted him. The realm might still be flawed, but it was alive, its heart still beating beneath the canopy of stars. In the hush of certain nights, when moonlight silvered the snow, Jon would slip away from his duties to stand beside his dragon on the ramparts, letting the cold wind ruffle his hair. There, he would close his eyes and recall the swirling darkness of that final battle, the wind howling as ice and fire clashed in the sky. He would remember the moment when Hracker's roar shattered the Night King's aura of silence, and the way Longclaw had sliced through the freezing gloom. It all felt distant, like a dream he had once lived. But the chill on his skin, the brush of scales against his shoulder, those were real anchors to the truth of what had happened and how far they had come. In time, the bards would embellish the tale, spinning it into grand songs of prophecy and destiny, weaving Jon's life into the tapestry of heroes and legends. They would speak of the bastard of Winterfell who rose to be king, the hidden Targaryen who flew an ice dragon, the man who ended the Night King's dark crusade. They would sing of Sansa the wise, Arya the swift, Bran the seer, and Daenerys of the dragons forging alliances that spanned the realm. Some details would be forgotten, others exaggerated, but the heart of the story would remain. In the moment of utmost peril, unity prevailed, and from the cold womb of winter, a dragon of ice emerged to protect the living. Jon knew these stories would live on long after he was gone. Though he sometimes felt uneasy about being cast as a hero, He took solace in the thought that future generations might glean courage from their example. That, in times of dire need, people might recall the story of an egg found in the crypts, of the boy who hatched it, and find in that memory the will to unite against any threat. And so he greeted each sunrise with quiet resolve, embracing his life for what it was. A tapestry woven from duty and love, from old bonds and new beginnings, from the power of ice and the promise of fire. Thus ended the long night of waiting, and began a new chapter for the North and for all Westeros. The White Walkers were gone, their frosty dominion shattered. The realm had breathed again under a sky that held not dread, but the glittering possibility of distant stars. And far above, circling in slow, elegant patterns, was the last living ice dragon, its eyes reflecting the promise that even in the darkest winter, hope could bloom. Hracker soared against the backdrop of the moon, letting out one final roar, sending a gust of chilly wind across the battlements. Below, Jon Snow looked up, a faint smile on his face, and lifted a hand in silent greeting. Their story, of a king and his ice dragon, had already reshaped the fate of the world. And in that quiet, unspoken accord between man and beast, it was clear that whatever challenges might come, they would face them together. Spring did not come swiftly to the north. Even after the Night King's destruction, snow still blanketed the fields around Winterfell, and the wind howled through the courtyard as though it had never learned another song. Yet a gentler air began to creep in with each sunrise. Icicles dripped from the castle eaves, water trickling into the courtyard's drains. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible unless one watched carefully for the softened edges of snowbanks or the milder tone in the breeze at midday. But the people of Winterfell noticed. After the long, terrible winter of war, they had learned to track hope in the smallest signs. Jon Snow, for his part, found it difficult to adjust to the lull. Dawn no longer broke over a fortress braced for battle. No war horns startled him awake, and no frantic knocks on his chamber doors demanded immediate counsels of war. Where once the nights had been spent in anxious anticipation of whites and White Walkers, now he listened to the quiet crackle of the hearth fire. Each morning, he rose and tended to the 1,000 duties of a king, petitions from local lords, judgments on disputes between farmers, negotiations over supply routes, and the slow rebuild of the battered castle grounds. He was grateful that such tasks existed, that the realm had returned to problems that could be settled with parchment and reason, rather than swords and dragons. Still, he could never quite shake the vigilance that had taken root in his soul. The memory of the Night King's army was too raw. When the old war wounds throbbed, he would climb the battlements of Winterfell to clear his head. The gusts of wind were cold even in this budding spring, and the vantage let him peer across the land that had once been choked in dread. Sometimes he saw children rolling wooden hoops across the muddy roads or playing games of tag around the remnant snowdrifts. Farmers pushed wheelbarrows loaded with seeds and tools. A handful of visitors, southerners, from the way they huddled in furs, milled in the courtyard, gaping at Winterfell's towers. To Jon, such ordinary sights felt like wonders. Life continued. Hracker was often perched on the highest tower these days, as though the dragon enjoyed surveying the realm it had helped save. Its pale, crystal-laced scales gleamed under the sun. Here and there, streaks of silver had begun to manifest along the ridges that ran from crown to tail. The beast was still more slender than Daenerys's dragons, built for agile flight rather than raw, fiery power, but it loomed imposingly over Winterfell's rooftops. Whenever Jon stepped onto the tower walkway, Hracker would rumble in recognition, the gust of its breath sprinkling frost into the air. Even when spring's earliest warmth stirred the ground below, the cold around Hracker remained constant, as though winter itself still lived in its lungs. Jon took comfort in that. Something about the dragon's presence felt protective rather than ominous. The realm had endured a war of ice and death, and now an ice dragon soared among them by choice, not by dread compulsion. On bright days, children on the walls watched Hracker with wide eyes, amazed that such a being could be real. Soldiers sometimes saluted the creature, whispering prayers under their breath. Old Nan's stories had once proclaimed ice dragons to be unstoppable monsters that heralded the end of days. Now, this living myth had folded itself into the daily life of Winterfell, albeit with care and watchful supervision from Jon, who ensured no unsuspecting traveler or precious livestock ended up caught in a swirl of sub-zero breath. He still remembered the first time Hracker ventured beyond the immediate sky around Winterfell. Some weeks after the victory, Jon had gone out at dawn to find the dragon absent from its usual perch. Panic had flared in his chest, brief but intense. Had Hracker deserted them, or perhaps roamed so far it could not find its way back? The worry had eaten at him for half the day until, just after sunset, a rush of wind rattled the castle windows and Hracker came gliding in from the northern horizon. Ice crystals swirled in its wake, and streaks of blue shimmered along its scales as it landed gracefully. Jon approached warily, only for Hracker to press its muzzle against his chest, leaving a slick of frost on his cloak in greeting. There had been no trace of hostility, only a sense that the dragon had needed to wander, to stretch its wings over the snow capes beyond the castle walls. From that day onward, Hracker took occasional flights far afield, though it never stayed away for more than a day or two. Sometimes it returned carrying the frozen carcass of an elk or a boar, feeding in quiet solitude in the fields before gliding back to its roost. When Jon asked Bran to see if he could glimpse the dragon's wanderings in one of his visions, Bran only shrugged. "It seems drawn north," he said, "like it's searching for something in the open tundra. But it always comes back. I sense no malice in it, only a kind of longing." Jon supposed the north itself was in Hracker's blood. It might never be content with just one castle as its domain. Still, the realm needed this dragon as a guardian, or at least as a symbol that the north was no longer defenseless before cosmic threats. Tales of Hracker had spread swiftly across Westeros. Merchants claimed it was proof the north was a land of icy sorcery and living myths. Sailors whispered that a single breath from its jaws could freeze entire ships in port. In taverns, bards sang verses about Jon, the king in the north who was half Targaryen yet wholly Stark, forging alliances that had saved mankind from an endless winter. The songs were flattering, if sometimes comically exaggerated. They painted Jon as a demigod who tamed winter itself. He couldn't help but cringe at the idea of his own legend creeping into the same pantheon as great warriors of old. Yet he did not forbid the songs, nor did he correct them too harshly. The realm needed heroes, even if the truth was more complicated. In time, Daenerys Targaryen sent word that she would soon return to Winterfell, bearing fresh negotiations on forging a unified peace. Her presence in the north had lessened in the months following the final battle as she traveled south to quell unrest. Some lords of the Reach had balked at sending their harvests northward, citing the old Targaryen claim to sovereignty. Others, particularly in King's Landing, still whispered that Daenerys's dragons were a threat to the stability of the Seven Kingdoms. Jon had done what he could to keep lines of communication open, exchanging letters by Raven, each time reminding her that the North stood by her so long as she respected its independence and recognized the deep ties between them. The question of his parentage, Rhaegar Targaryen's blood running through his veins, had always hung in the background. But for now, there was peace. She arrived at the gates of Winterfell one crisp afternoon in early thaw, flanked by an honor guard of Unsullied and a retinue of Westerosi knights who had pledged fealty to her cause. Drogon, grown enormous, roared overhead. Rhaegal accompanied him, smaller but still formidable, casting a long shadow across the courtyard. For a brief moment, the old anxiety in the hearts of Winterfell's people resurfaced, the memory of Targaryen conquest and dragons circling overhead. But then they saw Hracker perched on a tower, calm as a watchful wolf, observing its draconic cousins without aggression. It was a meeting of living legends. For a breathless instant, the sky shimmered with possibility. Two lines of dragons, one born of fire, the other shaped by ice, balanced in uneasy harmony over the storied castle. Jon greeted Daenerys in the courtyard. She dismounted gracefully, her silver-white hair twisting in the wind. Time had not lessened the regal poise she carried, nor the warmth in her eyes when she looked at Jon. He knelt, though only slightly, in a greeting that combined respect and friendship more than vassalage. She smiled. "Your Grace," she said softly. "It's been too long." He rose, returning the smile. "Far too long," he agreed. "Winterfell welcomes you always, Daenerys Stormborn, mother of dragons, breaker of chains." He let the formality slip in, partly out of courtesy, partly to show the Watchers that he still honored their alliance. Then he added more quietly, "Thank you for coming. Sansa awaits you in the Great Hall. We can discuss the harvest shipments and what the crown might do to help restore the lands ravaged by the war." Daenerys's gaze flicked upward, to where Hracker's silhouette cut an imposing figure against the pale sky. Pensive look crossed her features. "I see your hatchling is no hatchling anymore. Has it caused you any trouble?" "No," Jon said. "If anything, it served as a deterrent to bandits and would-be raiders. The North feels safer with Hracker aloft. We've had less trouble from the mountain clans or the pirates along the coast." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Incredible. I confess, It still unsettles me to know there is an ice dragon in this world. Part of me expected it to vanish when the White Walkers fell, as though it was bound only to that dark magic. But it endures, a testament to another kind of power. One that isn't necessarily dark, but ancient and tied to the north in a way I can hardly comprehend. Jon considered that. He glanced at Hracker again, watching the slow ripple of those crystalline scales. It endures. Maybe we all endure. Fire and ice. Seems the realm needs both. Daenerys studied him for a moment, then brushed a strand of hair from her face. Then let us see what else the realm needs. I'm told the supplies from the Crownlands will arrive within a month. I'd rather speak inside, away from prying ears. Inside the Great Hall, Sansa received the Queen with measured courtesy. Though she had grown more accustomed to ruling, Sansa's face still showed that resolute, cool, stark composure. She guided Daenerys to a seat of honor. Tyrion Lannister was there as well, having made the journey north as Hand of the Queen. He wore a heavy cloak against the chill, and his eyes roamed the hall as though cataloging every detail for future use. There was still tension among some of the northern lords, who had never quite forgiven the Lannisters for past treacheries. But they held their tongues, aware that Jon valued Tyrion's counsel, and that grudges must sometimes be set aside for the good of the realm. They spoke at length about trade routes and distribution of resources. Many of the southern fields had not suffered the same devastation as the north, but the harvests were smaller than hoped. King's Landing remained a seat of power, though its population had dwindled from the years of war. Daenerys, stepping into her role as a peacetime monarch, stressed her desire to see the entire realm stabilized. Her dragons, she said, would not be used to intimidate but to ensure safe passage for our grain shipments. In turn, the north would share its ample supplies of dragonglass from the old mines near the wall, still precious to some, even if the White Walker threat had vanished. Certain superstitious lords insisted on forging dragonglass weapons, just in case. None who had fought the dead wanted to be caught unprepared if some dark force ever rose again. Jon listened, occasionally contributing suggestions for fortifying crucial roads. He recommended reinforcing moats and watchtowers rather than building more large forts. We don't need more seats of power, he said quietly. We need watchful eyes on the horizon. Let's not forget how easily we were surprised by the Night King at the wall. It was a sober reminder. Even Tyrion's usual wry humor fell silent for a moment, replaced by thoughtful agreement. As the discussions wound on, servants placed a hot meal before them, trenchers of stew, loaves of bread, and a decanter of northern ale. The tension in the hall relaxed incrementally, turning from formal negotiations to something that felt almost companionable. The unsaid truth was that they had all faced extinction together and prevailed. Such experiences forged a bond that even politics could not wholly erode. After the meeting, Jon found Daenerys standing on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. Dusk had fallen, painting the sky with purple and gray. Torches flickered along the walls, and the wind tugged at her hair. She looked pensive, hugging her fur-lined cloak tight. He stepped beside her, leaning on the cold stone. "Are you well?" She gave a small laugh without much humor. "I think so, but everything has changed. When we first met, my mind was set on the Iron Throne. It was all I wanted, to break the wheel, to free the Seven Kingdoms. After the Great War, I saw a different purpose, protecting the living against the dead. Now that the dead are gone, I'm faced with a realm that needs healing, not conquest. The dragons have become symbols of fear to some, awe to others. And me? I'm a queen trying to guide a realm that still sees me as an outsider. It's complicated." Jon nodded slowly. "The North sees me differently too, after all that's happened. And what I am, what I discovered about my father, doesn't simplify matters. But perhaps it's for the best. We don't need a single iron seat to unify us. We need trust." She turned, eyes searching his face. "Do you trust me, Jon?" He held her gaze, thinking back to all they had endured, the sacrifices made, the times their trust in one another had been tested by war and secrets. Yet here she stood, not as a conqueror, but as an ally helping to rebuild. "Yes," he said, I trust you. She let out a breath. Then that's enough. We'll see this realm rebuilt, whether I wear a crown in the south or not. Another gust of wind swept over the ramparts, carrying with it the distant sound of dragons roaring in the skies. Daenerys closed her eyes, as if drawing strength from the sound. Sometimes I think of returning across the narrow sea to the free cities or even further east to the Dothraki Sea. But I know my duty is here, just as yours is here in the north. We share a purpose yet again. Jon placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The battles we fight now might be smaller in scale, but they're no less important. The realm needs time to mend, and we're the ones who must guide it. She nodded, placing her hand over his. So be it. In the following days, Daenerys's retinue settled into Winterfell, forging new ties with the northern lords. Tyrion spent hours in the library with Samwell Tarly, exchanging knowledge about governance. Grey Worm drilled with the Unsullied in the courtyard, earning grudging admiration from the northern soldiers. The Dothraki, fewer in number now but still fierce, kept mostly to themselves, but they were no longer the terrifying outsiders they had once seemed. They scouted the region's roads, forging respect through their skill on horseback. Jon took Daenerys to see Hracker up close. She stood at a safe distance, her posture careful. Drogon and Rhaegal, perched beyond the castle walls, snorted as though uneasy about their queen venturing too near this strange cousin. But Hracker only stirred, regarding Daenerys with eyes the color of pale moonlight. Jon stood by its head, stroking the ridges of ice-like scales behind its skull. The dragon's breath emerged in soft pulses of frost, drifting like silver smoke into the air. It still unsettles me, Daenerys murmured. So similar and yet so different. As if all the cold of winter has been made flesh in it. Jon glanced at Hracker. It's dangerous, yes, but not malicious. It understands who we are. It fought beside us when it mattered most. She raised a gloved hand, letting Hracker catch her scent. The dragon's nostrils flared, releasing a delicate mist. For a moment, the two regarded each other, woman and beast, mother of dragons and the living emblem of an ancient northern force. Finally, Hracker turned its head away, a languid movement that scattered drifting snow from its wings. Daenerys exhaled, stepping back. I appreciate its acceptance, she said with a wry smile, though I can tell I'm not its rider. No, Jon said gently. That bond seems to be, well, between me and it. Perhaps it's because I found the egg. Or because it needed a Stark and in some strange sense, Targaryen blood too. She studied him in silence, thoughtful. Then she nodded and moved away, leaving Jon to stand beside the dragon, the chill radiating from its skin seeping through his thick coat. He could feel the faint pulse of life beneath those scales, a rhythmic thrum like a heartbeat made of wind and snow. Over time, he had learned that Hracker's moods shifted with the weather, more restless in storms, more subdued in the hush of falling snow, curious on clear days. It was still a wild thing, but one that recognized Winterfell as home. Yet not every corner of the realm accepted the rise of House Stark and its alliance with the Targaryens. Whispers reached Winterfell of discontent in the Iron Islands, where certain captains argued that the seas should belong to them alone. The new lady of the Iron Islands, chosen by their own custom, was said to be forging alliances with pirates along the stepstones, hoping to reinstate old reaving traditions now that the threat of the White Walkers was gone. In the Westerlands, a few lords remained bitter at the downfall of Cersei and the cost they had paid. One or two minor bannermen from the old Lannister lines muttered that the Targaryens had always been a plague on the realm. It was Tyrion who advised caution when dealing with these rumors. We cannot keep the entire realm in line by fear or by force, he told Jon and Daenerys one evening in the Solar, where maps were spread across a large table. Sending dragons to burn out discontent is precisely what fosters more rebellion. We need to show them that stability is in their best interest. Give them a stake in the prosperity we're creating. Daenerys leaned forward, eyes narrowed at the map. And what if these lords and captains begin raiding our coasts, capturing our ships? Do we let them roam free? Tyrion offered a small bow of acknowledgement. Of course not. We respond decisively to raids. But we focus on capturing pirates, punishing the offenders, not entire peoples. Make an example of the worst instigators, but then offer the rest an olive branch. Show that defiance only leads to personal ruin for the disobedient, while loyalty brings trade, safety, and growth. Jon tapped a finger on the depiction of the narrow sea. We can also bolster our garrisons along the coasts. The north has fewer ships, but we do have allies in the Vale and in White Harbor. We can coordinate with them to keep an eye on suspicious movements. If the Ironborn see that the entire coastline is alert, maybe they'll think twice. Daenerys nodded in agreement. Let it be done. If I've learned anything from my earlier campaigns, it's that fear alone is not enough to govern. I want to avoid more bloodshed if we can. And so they began the laborious process of sending ravens, forging trade pacts, dispatching envoys, and stationing small contingents of soldiers along strategic points. It was a delicate dance. Too heavy a hand would reignite the fires of rebellion, too light a touch would invite raiding. Jon took personal care in selecting northern men who could adapt to living by the coast. He even invited some of the free folk who had proven themselves fierce warriors and surprisingly adept at maritime tasks when given the chance. Slowly but surely, a network of watchful outposts stretched from White Harbor down into the Vale's ports, ensuring a measure of stability. Meanwhile, life inside Winterfell continued to shift. Arya Stark returned briefly from her explorations, bringing tales of wonders across the sea. Mysterious isles in the west, rumors of forgotten kingdoms. She stayed only long enough to embrace her siblings and share a few nights of feasting. Sansa found herself increasingly occupied with the daily governance of the north. She navigated trade deals, arbitrated feuds between lesser houses, and overseen expansions to the library and the granaries. She and Jon made a formidable team. He handled the grand strategies of alliances and defenses while she ensured the local matters were in good order. And Bran, ever the enigma, slipped in and out of his visions, sometimes offering cryptic insights that guided policy, other times vanishing for days on end. When pressed, he only said, "I see many paths. I try to find the ones where we survive." Often, Jon would find solace in the Godwood, where the heart tree's face watched over the quiet pool. The white bark bore silent witness to centuries of Stark history. When life felt tangled with politics and lingering threats, he would kneel by the ancient roots, listening to the whisper of the wind among the red leaves. Sometimes Ghost padded beside him, watchful eyes scanning the shadows. Other times, Jon sensed Bran's presence, though whether physically or through one of his uncanny abilities was not always clear. Once, as Jon touched the carved face in the trunk, he felt an odd trembling in his body, something like a faraway memory that wasn't his own. He wondered if the old gods or the spirit of the weirwood recognized him as a guardian of the realm. Or perhaps it was just his imagination, shaped by years of hardship and the knowledge that he was not Ned Stark's son in blood, yet remained so in spirit. The nights grew shorter, each dusk unveiling a slightly later hour of darkness. Crocuses and snowdrops began to poke through the thinning patches of snow in the courtyards. The shift to spring felt real at last. As the temperatures rose around Winterfell, Hracker became more restless. Jon noticed that the dragon often soared away at dawn and did not return until twilight, slipping in with a spray of ice crystals along its wings. Each time, the watchers on the walls marveled, uncertain what business a dragon had in the far northern wastes. Jon himself did not question Hracker's roaming too harshly. He understood that no chain, real or metaphorical, could hold a being of such primal power. So long as Hracker returned to Winterfell of its own will, the bond remained unbroken. And then, one evening, as Jon stood on the ramparts watching the horizon fade to lilac and pink, a figure in battered furs came staggering through the gatehouse. At first, Jon did not recognize him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick red beard matted from travel. But as the man stumbled into the torchlight, Jon felt a rush of surprise and relief. It was Tormund Giantsbane, the fierce free-folk chieftain who had taken some of his people back beyond the wall after the war. His face was lined with exhaustion and his eyes flickered with concern. Jon hurried down to greet him in the courtyard. Tormund greeted him with a bone-rattling embrace. "Jon Snow," he exclaimed, though there was little mirth in his voice. "I hoped I'd find you here, King of the Bloody North." "Tormund, what's happened?" Jon asked. He could see new scars on Tormund's forearms. His furs were caked in mud and ice, as though he'd traveled through harsh storms to get here. Tormund shook his head, still catching his breath. "We've been living beyond the wall, in the old haunts. Strange things are stirring. Not wights, no, they're gone, thank the gods, but storms that come out of nowhere, blinding, furious. And there are rumors amongst some of the clans we met, talk of a shadowy figure moving through the old lands, leaving frozen corpses in its wake." Jon felt a spike of fear. "Frozen corpses? Like the dead rising?" "No," Tormund said, though the denial seemed uncertain. "These ones didn't rise. But they were found with wide eyes and twisted limbs, as if something froze them from the inside out. Might be just wild talk. But my people are spooked. There's also talk of a shape in the sky, white as winter, flying over the forests. Could be your ice dragon, or maybe something else. Who knows?" Jon glanced up at the tower where Hracker often perched. "Hracker does fly north sometimes, yes, but I don't see how that would cause frozen corpses. A grim thought flickered through him. The Night King had been destroyed, but the lands beyond the wall were ancient and mysterious, and not all powers were tied to that single threat. He forced calm into his voice. Rest, Tormund. We'll talk more in the morning when you've eaten. Tormund gave a tired nod, though he fixed Jon with a serious look. I've got a bad feeling about it, Snow. Like an echo of the darkness we thought we cast out. You'd best prepare. The North might not be done with monsters. In the days that followed, Tormund's warnings spread through Winterfell's halls. It unsettled many who had hoped the victory over the Night King was final. Sansa proposed sending rangers to investigate. Jon agreed, though he insisted they be volunteers. Enough men had spilled blood beyond the wall. But surprisingly, many warriors stepped forward, including some of the free folk who had joined Tormund, a few of the Night's Watch remnants who now served the North directly, and even some knights from the Vale. The memory of the Night King's threat was too recent. If there was any chance another terror brewed in the far north, they wanted to quell it before it reached civilized lands. They set out a small, hardy expedition. Jon wanted to lead it himself, but Sansa and Daenerys urged him to remain. The North needs its king here, Daenerys said firmly. If something worse than rumor waits beyond the wall, we can't risk you falling into its clutches. Jon bristled at the caution, but he could not deny the realm's need for stability. In the end, he reluctantly agreed, appointing Ser Davos and Tormund as co-leaders of the group. Davos, ever loyal and pragmatic, accepted the task with a resigned nod. He joked that he had once dreamed of retiring to a small keep by the sea, yet here he was, riding into the teeth of northern storms. The expedition set off with Tormund at the fore, his red beard flashing in the pale sunlight. The gates of Winterfell closed behind them with a groan. Jon stood atop the walls, watching them vanish into the horizon of white. Despite the warming weather around Winterfell, the far north remained locked in ice. He prayed the rumors were mere superstition, stories conjured by wildlings still haunted by memories of the army of the dead. But some instinct told him there was truth in Tormund's fear. Winter's magic ran deeper than the Night King alone. For a time, Jon busied himself with routine governance, waiting anxiously for news. Daenerys, having extended her stay, provided counsel. They walked together in the courtyard, discussing how best to deal with possible instability in the southern regions. Tyrion recommended caution when dispatching troops. Spreading them too thin would invite new pockets of rebellion. Sansa championed focusing on the North's own defenses. The tension was a faint echo of the war councils they had held before the battle with the dead. Except now the threat was nebulous, shadowed in rumor. One morning, Hracker returned from one of its long flights, landing heavily on the broken tower. Jon went to greet it, noticing something unusual. Ice rimed the edges of its scales more thickly than ever, forming razor-like protrusions along its tail. The dragon's eyes were alert, scanning the courtyard with a restless vigor. Jon climbed the crumbling steps to the tower top. At his approach, Hracker swung its head, unleashing a brief swirl of frost breath. Jon raised a hand, stepping through the chill. "What did you find out there?" he murmured, knowing it was foolish to expect an answer in words. Still, he sensed a tension in Hracker's posture, as though the dragon had been in conflict or chased something. A faint scratch along its left flank glistened with frozen blood, an injury that might have been inflicted by another beast, or an ice-laden branch, or any of 100 hazards in the wild. But it felt too deliberate, too unsettling. Jon gently placed a gloved hand on the wound, examining it. Hracker rumbled low in its throat, letting him see. The scratch was narrow, an odd shape that didn't quite match an animal's claw or a sword. A sense of unease crawled along Jon's spine. "What did this?" he repeated softly. The dragon's eyes flared with an inner glow, as though it sensed Jon's concern. Then it turned away, scanning the skies to the north. Jon followed its gaze, seeing only the gray horizon. Within a week, a raven arrived from Castle Black, the Old Night's Watch stronghold. The message was terse. The expedition had arrived there safely but had discovered signs of some unnatural phenomenon beyond the wall, ice formations that defied normal weather patterns as if shaped by deliberate hands. Frozen corpses had been found, indeed, but there was no sign of them reanimating. Davos wrote that local wildling scouts spoke of hearing whispers in the wind, moans that sometimes carried through the trees without source. Tormund was leading small forays deeper into the haunted forests, searching for any sign of a new threat. They planned to return with more concrete information soon. Another fortnight passed with no further ravens. The days felt long, each sunrise bringing fresh speculation in Winterfell's halls. Daenerys discussed the matter with Jon and Sansa, suggesting they might dispatch Drogon or Rhaegal to patrol the skies beyond the wall, searching for the expedition. But the distances were vast, and they risked losing the dragons in storms if something supernatural indeed lurked. Besides, Daenerys was reluctant to let her dragons traverse such unfamiliar, hostile territory without a rider who knew the land well. "My children are strong," she said, "but we must be cautious." Finally, a raven arrived at dawn, bearing grim news. The expedition had vanished. Davos's last message, delivered by a single rider returning to Castle Black, stated that Tormund and his party had encountered a circle of standing stones deep in the tundra, etched with glyphs that no one recognized. An eerie cold hung over the place, even more biting than usual. Scouts who ventured too close reported hearing a faint humming, as if the stones vibrated with some hidden energy. Then, on the following morning, half the horses were found frozen stiff, their eyes wide with terror. Davos had ordered a retreat, but Tormund insisted they press on to discover the source of this phenomenon, determined to end the threat. They argued. In the chaos, something attacked in the darkness, scattering the party. Davos's letter ended abruptly with a note that he was going to search for Tormund and bring him back or die trying. Since then, no word had come. Jon read the message twice, feeling the weight of every line. The old dread that he thought banished with the Night King seeped back into his heart. He handed the parchment to Sansa with a grim look. "We can't ignore this anymore," he said. "If Tormund and Davos are lost, we have to find them, or at least find out what happened." Sansa's expression was a mix of worry and determination. "We can't afford another war. We've barely rebuilt. But we also can't let some new darkness rise unchecked." Daenerys, at the table, folded her hands. "I'll go," she said quietly. "I'll take Drogon and Rhaegal, along with a small force. Dragons can travel faster in the north." "We can." Jon shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, but this requires more than dragonfire. Something out there, in that circle of stones, might be beyond anything we've dealt with. We need people who know the land, who fought in those conditions. We need Tormund, Davos, and me." "You can't go personally," Sansa insisted, her voice tight. "The realm needs you here." Jon's eyes flicked to Daenerys. "I'm king in the north. If a threat stirs beyond the wall, that's my responsibility. I won't send others to face it while I hide in Winterfell." She closed her eyes, her posture rigid. "I understand," she murmured. "But I won't let you go alone. I'll come too." When Jon began to protest, she lifted a hand. "We overcame the Night King by uniting fire and ice. If there is a new threat, we may need dragons of both kinds again." Sansa drew in a sharp breath, her gaze darting between them. "At least take a strong escort, and leave someone reliable to govern in your absence. Arya's away. Bran can't shoulder it alone. That leaves me." Jon set a hand on Sansa's shoulder. "You've been doing it already, in truth. I trust you." Daenerys spoke next, her voice decisive. "Then we gather a small force. We'll bring men we trust, those who won't panic if faced with strange magic. Grey Worm, some of your best Unsullied, if you agree. A handful of Northern Rangers. And Ghost, of course. If Hracker chooses to follow, that might help too. The rest of our forces remain here, under Sansa's command, to keep the north stable." Tyrion, who had listened in silence, spoke at last. "I'll stay, if that's your wish. Someone must advise Lady Sansa on matters of southern diplomacy. But please be careful. We once thought we'd seen the worst the world could throw at us. Let's not underestimate what else might be lurking." Jon could see the genuine worry in the dwarf's eyes. He gave a curt nod. "We'll be cautious. I won't risk any more lives than necessary." Thus began a flurry of preparations. Ravens flew out to gather the best rangers, men who had served the Night's Watch or fought in the war against the dead. Supplies were packed for extreme cold. Furs, rope, dried meats, dragonglass weapons, though they were uncertain if such arms would help against a threat not tied to the White Walkers. Grey Worm selected a squad of Unsullied all-volunteers. Each man carried a spear tipped with Valyrian steel where possible, or at least castle-forged steel. Daenerys readied Drogon and Rhaegal for flight. Jon had no illusions that it would be an easy journey, even traveling by dragon. The far north was vast, the weather volatile. Hracker sensed the rising tension. In the nights leading up to departure, Jon found the ice dragon perched ever closer to the courtyard, as though waiting. When at last the time came to depart, the small force assembled in Winterfell's yard at dawn. Grey Worm stood at attention with his unsullied, while a group of northern rangers with weathered faces checked their gear. Samwell Tarly insisted on joining, citing his knowledge of arcane lore. Jon hesitated, but Sam argued passionately that he might recognize any magical signs if the Circle of Stones was some old ritual site. Jon relented, recalling how Sam's wisdom had often saved them in the past. A few of the free folk who had remained south of the wall also volunteered, wearing patchwork armor and brandishing crude but serviceable axes and bows. Sansa embraced Jon, her face taut with worry. "Come back," she whispered. "Bring them home. And if it's too dangerous, I'll do what must be done," Jon assured her quietly. "You know me." She nodded, forcing a small smile. Then she turned to Daenerys. "Keep him alive, if you can." Daenerys's gaze was steady. "I intend to." The two women clasped hands in a silent promise. With that, Jon swung into the saddle of a hardy northern horse. Daenerys, dressed in thick white and gray riding leathers, climbed gracefully onto Drogon's back. Rhaegal took flight beside them, circling overhead. Hracker stood at the far end of the yard, wings half spread, frost curling from its maw. For a moment, Jon wondered if the dragon would simply follow them on its own accord, or if it would vanish northward ahead of them. But as the gates opened and the expedition set forth, Hracker launched itself into the sky, letting out a keening cry that echoed across the battlements. Ghost loped beside Jon's horse, silent and watchful, a flicker of white fur in the swirl of cold air. The ride north began in a hush of expectation. They traveled first along the King's Road that led toward Castle Black, but even that route was sparsely traveled since the end of the war. Snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves, though pockets of thaw revealed patches of barren earth. They passed the remains of old battlefields, broken cartwheels, half buried in drifts, blackened pikes standing crooked in the ground. Memories of the war lingered in every burnt tree or collapsed cottage. It reminded them how fragile peace could be. Despite the gloom, the presence of dragons overhead drew wonder from any settlers or travelers they encountered. Daenerys kept Drogon and Rhaegal relatively low, scanning the horizon. Hracker glided higher, an almost ghostly shape against the pale clouds. Sometimes villagers emerged from huts, shielding their eyes to watch the strange assembly pass. Northern soldiers, unsullied warriors, and 3 dragons, 2 born of fire, 1 of ice. Jon thought he glimpsed equal parts terror and hope in their faces. They reached the ruins of the last hearth, seat of Houseumber, by nightfall. Though the castle walls were partially rebuilt, it was still a shadow of what it had once been. No living Umbers remained there after the wars. A few settlers had taken up residence in the less damaged halls, trying to rebuild a life. They greeted Jon politely, offering what scant hospitality they could. The largest hall served as a communal shelter, with a single massive hearth providing warmth. Jon's party slept there, listening to the howling wind that battered the rafters. At dawn, they pressed on, leaving behind the last vestiges of what could be called civilization. Castle Black stood stark as ever against the white expanse of the wall. Though the wall itself was partially breached by the magic that once allowed the Night King to pass, some sections still towered mightily over the land, an imposing barrier of ice. A skeleton crew of Night's Watch remained, old men, young recruits, and a few veterans with missing limbs or haunted eyes. They greeted Jon and Daenerys with reverence, uneasy at the sight of so many dragons. One of the senior Black brothers explained that Tormund's expedition had indeed passed through weeks ago, returning only briefly to gather supplies and leaving again with worried looks. No new word had arrived since. The next morning, they ventured beyond the ruined gates where once the Night's Watch had manned the lift. Now, much of that mechanism was in disrepair. They had to guide the horses around a path winding through rocky terrain, for the breach in the wall had left colossal shards of ice and debris strewn across the landscape. Even in spring, the cold here was lethal, the wind biting through any gap in one's cloak. Some of the Unsullied grew pale and used to such frigid conditions, but they pressed on without complaint. Daenerys and her dragons took to the sky, scanning ahead. Hracker soared in a wide circle, venturing farther north, sometimes vanishing beyond the horizon. Jon led the ground party, relying on free folk hunters to guide them along safer routes. The terrain was treacherous, frozen rivers hidden under fresh snow, sudden ravines carved by shifting ice. More than once, a horse stumbled and they had to haul it free of a hidden crevasse. The going was slow, tension building as each day passed without sight of Tormund or Davos. At last, after a week of careful travel, they reached an area where the trees grew dense. The gnarl of branches formed a skeletal canopy overhead, blocking most of the weak sunlight. The wind gusted eerily, carrying faint echoes that made the men glance around as if expecting ghosts. The dragons landed periodically in small clearings, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. The horses stamped nervously in the presence of Drogon and Regal, though they had grown somewhat accustomed to Hracker, whose quiet grace and chilly aura seemed less overtly threatening. Toward evening, Ghost trotted ahead, sniffing at the air. Jon followed, and soon they came upon a gruesome sight, a half-collapsed tent pinned under snow with broken spears and torn cloaks scattered around. The ground was stained with dark patches that might once have been blood. Samwell Tarly knelt by the debris, carefully turning over a scrap of fabric. "This is from Castle Black," he said quietly. "It's one of Davos's men." Grey Worm's jaw tightened, eyes scanning the surrounding gloom. "Be on guard." Jon dismounted and walked carefully among the wreckage. He found a battered wooden shield with the Night's Watch insignia. Nearby, the snow was churned up as though a struggle had taken place. It seemed no one had survived here, but neither were their bodies. There was only a sense of something having taken them or driven them off. A hush fell over the party, the soldiers exchanging uneasy glances. The old fear of the dead returning flickered in their minds. They set camp with extreme caution, posting double sentries. Dragons perched around the clearing, their presence a deterrent to any normal predator. Jon spent the night in troubled sleep, haunted by dreams of swirling snow and echoes of cries. He saw Tormund's face, twisted in alarm, then Davos's, stoic and grim. In his dream, the circle of standing stones loomed, etched with faintly glowing runes. A shape stood at its center, impossible to discern, but radiating an aura of icy malice. Then Jon woke, heart hammering, the cold sweat on his brow. Even with Ghost sleeping by his side, he felt no comfort. At first light, they moved on, pushing deeper into the forest. Hracker, crouched near the treetops, let out a sudden cry that reverberated. Jon followed the dragon's line of sight and saw through the tangled branches a thin plume of smoke. Without hesitation, they made for it, forging a path around fallen logs and snowbanks until they emerged into a small clearing. There, they found a ragged campsite and two survivors huddled beside a meager fire, Tormund Giantsbane and Davos Seaworth. Relief flooded Jon. He dismounted and hurried to them, kneeling by their side. Davos looked gaunt, his skin sallow from cold and hunger, but his eyes lit up at the sight of Jon. "You came," he managed, his voice hoarse. Tormund was in no better shape. His hair and beard were tangled with ice, and a bandage covered a nasty wound on his shoulder. He tried to grin, though it came out more like a pained grimace. "Snow," he said. "Took you long enough?" "The others?" Jon glanced around, seeing no sign of the rest of their expedition. "We found only wreckage." "Are there more survivors?" Davos shook his head, eyes downcast. "Some scattered, some died. A few were taken by something. We're not sure what. We lost them in the night. No whites, but something else out here. It hunts." He coughed. "Tormund insisted we keep going, but we couldn't find the circle of stones again, something about the forest shifting. Then a storm blew in, near froze us to death. We've been moving from place to place ever since." Jon felt a chill deeper than the air. He signaled for the others to approach. Sam brought water, Grey Worm knelt to examine Tormund's wound, and Daenerys dismounted from Drogon, her eyes filled with concern. "We'll get you both back to Castle Black," she said. "You need proper care." Tormund groaned. "We didn't come all this way to turn back, not without answers. That circle of stones is out there. It's a damn place, I tell you, brimming with some old magic. We're not the only ones who felt it. My people have stories about it going back centuries. A place where the cold is alive." Jon glanced at Davos, who nodded tiredly. "We saw it once, just a glimpse from a ridge. The stones were arranged in a ring, each one carved with symbols that glowed faintly blue. Then the storm hit. By the time it cleared, we were completely disoriented. Couldn't find the ridge again." He exhaled shakily, looking at Jon. "It's not the White Walkers, but it's something akin to them, a power that doesn't belong in this world." A heavy silence fell. Daenerys wrapped her cloak tighter around her. Ghost paced near Tormund, sniffing him as if checking for serious injuries. Hracker perched at the edge of the clearing, gaze fixed on the group, the bright aura in its eyes flickering with a strange intensity. Jon nodded slowly, his decision made. "We'll find these standing stones. And if they pose a danger to the realm, we'll break them. One threat beyond the wall nearly ended the world, we won't allow another to rise." Grey Worm and the Unsullied waited stoically while the Northern Rangers exchanged uneasy looks. Sam fidgeted with the straps of his pack, clearly unsettled by talk of ancient magic. Tormund coughed, a harsh rasp in the cold air. Then we'd best hurry. If we linger too long, we'll freeze or starve or worse. The forest here is treacherous. Daenerys motioned to Drogon and Rhaegal, each standing guard in the clearing. If the storm isn't too severe, I can search from the air. It might be easier to spot a ring of stones. Jon nodded. Go, but be careful. We'll follow on horseback. Tormund, you and Davos ride with us. Sam, keep your eyes open for anything that looks like old runes or glyphs. Grey Worm, keep our flanks secure. We move quietly. They broke camp swiftly, half expecting an attack at any moment, but the forest remained eerily silent. Daenerys mounted Drogon. Rhaegal followed, each beating massive wings that stirred the snow into whirling drifts. Jon helped Tormund onto a spare horse. The big man grumbled at the fuss, but Jon could see he was barely hanging on. Davos managed to mount another horse with some assistance, wincing at every motion. Then they pressed deeper. It felt like another realm entirely. The trees stretched impossibly tall, their trunks warped by centuries of harsh weather. Gnarled branches locked overhead, forming a skeletal tunnel that allowed little light. The air itself seemed thick, heavy with a presence. Jon recalled the dream of swirling gloom and flickering runes. He glanced upward, glimpsing the silhouettes of two dragons weaving through the canopy breaks, scanning the ground. A third shape soared in the distance, Hracker, moving in slow, wide arcs. Jon felt a measure of reassurance at that. By midday, they spotted a faint glow through the trees, as if a patch of sky had taken on a strange luminance. Daenerys and her dragons descended. She dismounted, her face pale. I saw the circle, she said quietly. Not far ahead, maybe a few miles. But there's a presence. Drogon and Rhaegal grew agitated, as if they sensed something that repels them. It's not fire or ice exactly, but a distortion. They wouldn't land close. Jon steeled himself. We'll approach on foot. Grey Worm, keep some men to guard the horses. The rest of you with me. He glanced at Tormund and Davos. Stay here if you're too weak. Tormund let out a snort. I didn't come all this way to warm a horse's backside. I'm going. Davos offered a wan smile, though he shivered. Same here, M-Lord. I've come this far. Might as well see it through. Jon nodded. Very well. Just stay behind me. Sam. Sam swallowed hard. Ready. They advanced slowly, weaving through ancient pines. The glow grew stronger, casting pale blue glimmers on the snow. Hracker soared overhead, circling with an almost predatory focus, though it kept its distance. At last, the trees opened into a bare clearing, the ground dusted with a thin coat of snow that reflected an otherworldly light. In the center stood a ring of towering stones, each monolith easily 4 times a man's height. Strange glyphs were etched on their surfaces, glowing with a pulsating blue-white radiance. The circle itself stood perhaps 50 paces across, the stones arranged at even intervals as if placed by precise hands. Jon felt a chill that went beyond the cold wind. The air near the circle seemed to hum, a soft vibration that penetrated the bones. Tormund grunted, rubbing his beard as though to ward off some unseen influence. Davos exhaled, breath clouding in the pale aura. Grey Worm signaled his men to fan out, forming a perimeter. Sam stepped forward, eyes wide, scanning the glyphs with quiet awe. I've never seen runes like these, he whispered, but they're reminiscent of the symbols the children of the forest once used, or something older. There's an intention here. This was built to harness power. Daenerys stood beside Jon, her expression resolute. Can we destroy it? Perhaps, Jon said. But let's first see if anything resides here. A sudden wind swept through the clearing, rustling the branches overhead. The glyphs flared brighter, and from the corner of Jon's vision, he saw movement. A shape, almost transparent, flickered between 2 of the stones. The Unsullied raised spears, forming a defensive line. Tormund cursed under his breath. Davos gripped the hilt of a borrowed sword with trembling fingers. Jon cautiously stepped forward, Longclaw at his side. We're not here for battle, he said, though he wasn't sure if any living or unliving thing could understand him. Show yourself. The air seemed to ripple. Then, emerging from behind a monolith, a figure took shape, lean and elongated, skin a colorless blue like glacial ice, eyes glowing with cold luminescence. It wore tattered robes that fluttered in an unfelt breeze, and in one hand it held a staff topped with what looked like a shard of ice. Where the White Walkers had an almost regal, humanoid form, this being was more insubstantial, its edges shimmering as though it existed halfway between this world and another. It tilted its head at Jon, unblinking. Daenerys shifted. Is that a spirit? Sam whispered, some kind of elemental, maybe? An ancient power. The runes might be binding it or letting it cross into our world. He took out a small leather journal, flipping pages anxiously. I've read accounts of echoes of the long night that lingered in remote places, but nothing this vivid. Grey Worm motioned for his men to hold steady. The being glided forward a few steps, raising its staff. A faint swirl of icy wind coiled at the staff's tip, dancing like ghostly fire. Jon sensed no immediate aggression, yet the tension was suffocating. We only seek to protect our realm, he called out, unsure if the entity could comprehend words. If you mean us harm, we'll defend ourselves. The figure's gaze flickered to Longclaw, to the Unsu. Lied spears to Daenerys. Then it swung its staff in a slow arc. The swirling energy at the tip expanded, forming a watery curtain of pale light. Within that light, images seemed to flicker, glimpses of an ancient forest, a land of perpetual twilight, swirling mists. Jon felt a rush of cold in his chest as though something tried to draw him forward. Tormund hissed, gripping his axe. Don't step closer, Snow. But Sam studied the images, fascinated. It's showing us something. Daenerys kept a hand near her belt knife, though it would be little use against a being of pure ice and spirit. She said quietly, what do you want us to see? As if in answer, the images shifted. A figure resembling the entity stood in a grove, chanting silently. Then shadows emerged, shadows with blazing blue eyes. White Walkers. The two forces clashed, swirling energies of frost like a war of cold fighting cold. The vision jumped, and Jon saw a swirling mass of darkness in the sky, a crack in reality from which shapes emerged, neither living nor dead. It was all too quick, fleeting. Then the vision ended and the circle flared. The spirit lowered its staff, the light fading from the tip. It stared at Jon, a silent question in its pale eyes. Sam let out a trembling breath. It's older than the White Walkers, or it fought them once. Maybe it wants help. Or it sees us as intruders. Tormund spat. It sure looked like a war to me. Davos, struggling to stand, rasped, is it possible that this being was left behind? Another kind of power that tried to stop the White Walkers in ages past? Daenerys' eyes flicked from the spirit to Jon. If that's true, then why did it kill the men we found frozen? Why the ominous rumors? Sam answered haltingly, perhaps it can't distinguish friend from foe. Or maybe there's a price to its power. Those who draw too close suffer the consequences. Jon stood firm, gripping Longclaw. He recalled how the Night King had enslaved the cold to raise an army. Could this thing be an opposite force, or simply another face of the same winter magic? We're not your enemies, he said again, voice steady. We destroyed the White Walkers. They threatened all life. We stand against any threat that seeks to bring endless winter. The spirit's eyes seemed to flicker with renewed intensity. It raised the staff again. This time, the swirling energy spread across the circle of stones, each rune flaring bright. The hum in the air grew louder, pressing at the eardrums. Grey Worms unsullied tightened their ranks, uncertain whether to attack. Tormund cursed, bracing for a fight. Sam looked on in astonishment even as he took a step back. Then the circle erupted in a pillar of light. The force of it knocked many of them to the ground. Jon stumbled, lifting a hand to shield his face. Icy wind whipped around them, carrying shards of hail that cut like glass. Through squinted eyes, Jon saw the entity at the center of the swirl, staff raised to the sky. The monoliths vibrated with resonance, pulses of magic that seemed to tear at the fabric of the air. Some of the Unsullied shouted in pain, battered by the hail. Daenerys screamed over the roar of the wind, her hair lashing. Stop! But the spirit either could not hear or did not care. The runes glowed fiercely, arcs of energy leaping between them. The ground shook, cracks forming in the frozen earth. It felt as if a portal were being wrenched open. Jon forced himself forward, step by agonizing step, fighting the gale. Ghost and Tormund flanked him, their silhouettes blurred by the onslaught of ice. He had to stop whatever this was before it unleashed something worse than the White Walkers. He raised Longclaw, the Valyrian steel shimmering with reflected light. Don't do this, he roared. The spirit pivoted, locking eyes with Jon. A wave of chilling force slammed into him, hurling him back against a monolith. He gasped, pain spiking through his ribs. The staff flared again, intensifying the storm. Through the roar, Jon caught sight of Daenerys stumbling, her cloak torn by the wind, trying to reach him. Sam was prone on the ground, shielding his face. Grey Worm and his men pressed forward in a desperate phalanx, but the hail battered them relentlessly. Rhaegal and Drogon roared somewhere above the trees, unable to find a safe place to land. Then came another roar, deeper and more resonant. Hracker. The ice dragon swooped down from the canopy, smashing through branches in a flurry of snow. It dove toward the circle, wings spread wide. The spirit swirled to face this new threat, staff raised. A blast of cold energy erupted, meeting Hracker's own sub-zero breath in midair. The collision erupted in a shower of glittering shards, the ground trembling from the force. Even as Jon struggled to stand, he marveled that the spirit's ice magic and Hracker's breath seemed to clash, each refusing to yield. Frost crackled around them, forming a twisting vortex of bitter cold. But Hracker was flesh and blood, albeit infused with winter's power, while the spirit seemed to exist on another plane. Their clash lit the circle with a furious brilliance. Then the spirit pivoted, thrusting its staff at one of the monoliths. The rune there flared, and a tendril of energy lashed across the clearing, striking Hracker's flank. The ice dragon roared in agony, momentarily forced back. Frost plumed from its jaws, but the spirit was no mere white walker to be shattered by dragon steel or dragon flame. It glided aside, intangible, reappearing at another monolith, stoking the storm's intensity. Jon's lungs burned. He pressed a hand to his side, feeling broken ribs protest, but he staggered forward. He realized that the circle itself was fueling the spirit. If they could disrupt it, destroy the monoliths, perhaps the being would lose its anchor. He turned, searching for Daenerys, finding her crouched near a fallen Unsullied, helping him to his feet. He shouted over the gale, the stones. "We have to bring them down." Daenerys caught his meaning. She nodded, turning and waving her arms to signal the dragons above. Drogon and Rhaegal, swirling in confusion, roared in response. Then they descended upon the circle, unleashing torrents of flame. Their fire blasted the nearest monolith, and it cracked under the heat, showering fragments of glowing ice and stone. At the same time, Hracker rallied, unleashing a savage bellow. It smashed its tail against another monolith, the combined force of cold fracturing the ancient stone. 2 pillars fell, their glyphs darkening. The spirit hissed, an unearthly sound that cut through the wind. The circle's glow flickered as it lost 2 of its anchors. Grey Worm, seizing the opportunity, led his men forward, hacking at a third stone with spears and picks. Tormund threw himself at the base of another, using all his considerable strength to pry it loose. Sam, trembling, placed his hands on the runes, muttering a fervent incantation from some old text. The monolith vibrated under his touch, cracks forming like spiderwebs. With each stone destroyed, the storm lessened. The spirit grew frantic, darting from one to the next as if trying to maintain the magic. Finally, with half the circle in ruins, the swirling wind collapsed in on itself, leaving a deafening silence in the clearing. Jon, breathing heavily, raised Longclaw. The spirit hovered near the last standing monolith, staff lowered, its form flickering as though weakened. Another blast of dragonfire tore through the glade. The monolith exploded. The glyphs winked out, darkness replacing the pulsing blue glow. The spirit gave a final, piercing shriek, and then it dissolved into motes of light, drifting away on the wind. The hush that followed was absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Hracker landed heavily, sides heaving, a scorch mark from the spirit's tendril marring its flank. Drogon and Rhaegal circled overhead, their roars receding. Jon nearly collapsed to his knees, exhaustion overwhelming him. Daenerys was at his side in an instant, bracing him. Her face was streaked with sweat and frost, her hair tangled with bits of ice. "Is it over?" she whispered. He looked around the ruined circle, the shattered monoliths sending up plumes of dust and steam. The air was colder than ever, but the malevolent energy was gone. Tormund limped up, wincing from his own injuries. "I'd say so. That thing put up a hell of a fight." Davos approached, supported by 2 Unsullied. "It's gone. Gods be good." Sam stumbled toward them, still cradling a battered journal. He knelt beside a chunk of stone, studying the lifeless glyph etched into it. "I think that was some sort of ancient entity bound here to oppose the others. But over time, maybe it twisted. Or it needed power from outside. We'll never know for certain." He looked at Jon, eyes full of earnest relief. "But it's gone now. No more frozen corpses. No more storms." Grey Worm surveyed the aftermath, his expression solemn as he counted the dead and wounded. Though the confrontation had been brief, it left scars. Several Unsullied lay unmoving, battered by hail or pierced by flying debris. Northern Rangers coughed and groaned. Tormund's wound had reopened, blood staining his furs. Ghost padded among them, whining softly. Hracker folded its wings, letting out a low rumble that shuddered through the clearing. Daenerys helped Jon to his feet. Their gazes swept over the broken stones and the battered survivors. She spoke quietly. Once again, the North has faced a threat beyond mortal understanding. And once again, we've paid a heavy price. Jon nodded, feeling the ache in his ribs and the heavier ache in his heart. But we persevered. That's what we do. He turned to face the battered circle, its power extinguished. We'll bury our dead and honor them. Then we'll return. The North needs to know that the threat is ended. In the days that followed, they managed to limp back to Castle Black, carrying their wounded. Tormund and Davos, though gravely weakened, survived with Sam's careful tending. Grey Worm oversaw the funeral rites for his fallen unsullied with quiet dignity. Daenerys stood watchful, her gaze distant, weighed down by the loss. Jon found himself numb, as if he had already faced too much death to be shocked by more. Yet overshadowing the grief was the knowledge that they had prevented another calamity. The strange circle had been destroyed, and whatever lingering power it held was banished to memory. No more rumors of frozen corpses or storms plagued their journey south. When they arrived at Castle Black, the men of the Night's Watch stood in silent awe at the battered but victorious party. Hracker soared overhead, a silent sentinel. Drogon and Rhaegal landed on the outskirts, their presence enough to keep any threat at bay. They rested a few days to regain strength, then made the final trek back to Winterfell. By the time they crossed beneath the castle walls, it was well into spring. Snow had melted in broad patches, revealing muddy fields and the first stirrings of green. The people cheered as they saw their king and queen return alive, flanked by wounded men who nonetheless wore a sense of accomplishment. Sansa met them in the courtyard, tears shining in her eyes as she embraced Jon. He held her close, letting exhaustion melt into relief. Tyrion waited by her side, looking drawn with worry, though he offered a tight-lipped smile. "We feared the worst," he said simply. Jon exhaled. "We nearly faced it, but we're here now." In the days that followed, the survivors told their tale, and the North marveled yet again at the mysteries that lurked in the far reaches beyond the wall. Word spread that not every ancient power had died with the Night King, that the world was older and stranger than any living memory could recall. Yet the Ice Dragon, King Jon, and Queen Daenerys had prevailed once more, forging a fragile but enduring peace. Slowly, life in Winterfell resumed its rhythms. Daenerys eventually returned south, ensuring the stability of her territories but not before reaffirming her alliance with Jon. Tormund stayed a while to recuperate, then joined the free folk north of the Wall again, though he promised to keep an eye out for any further disturbances. Davos took a well-deserved rest, planning to split his time between advising Jon and tending to a small fishing hamlet near White Harbor. As for Hracker, it roamed as it ever did, though it no longer ventured as far north for quite some time. It preferred to stay close to Winterfell, occasionally taking flight for a day or two but always returning. Jon suspected the dragon had, in its own way, confronted a power akin to itself and emerged scarred but resolute. The scorch mark on its flank healed, leaving a faint pattern of crystalline ridges that glinted in the sun. Spring blossomed into a short, pleasant summer, the fields around Winterfell flourishing with crops. Villages that had once cowered in fear now bustled with new life. The people still whispered about dragons, 3 for the realm, 1 made of ice and 2 of fire, and a king who was half of each. But the whisper held more wonder than dread. Songs carried to distant corners of Westeros, praising the bond that had saved the realm not once but twice. Whether the next threat came from men, from the sea, or from the mysteries lurking in the old forests, the North was not defenseless. It had learned to stand on its own feet, guided by the memory of the dire wolf and the ice dragon who soared overhead. On many an evening, Jon would stand atop the battlements, gazing at the horizon where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Beside him, Ghost sat with unblinking eyes. Above, Hracker glided like a pale sentinel, wings catching the last rays of light. In such moments, Jon felt the weight of all that had happened, his resurrection, the war against the dead, the truths of his lineage, the forging of alliances. He did not know what the future held, only that he would face it head-on, guided by honor, love for his people, and the unyielding spirit that refused to let winter's darkness consume the world. For a time at least, peace reigned. The North had found its dragon, and the realm had found a champion who understood that true strength was born of unity, tempered by sacrifice and sustained by hope. In the months to come, travelers from far-off lands ventured to Winterfell, seeking audience with the king in the north. Princes from Dorne, merchant lords from Essos, and knights from the Reach rode the roads, marveling at tales of the ice dragon. Some came to form trade pacts, exchanging southern fruits for northern timber and dragonglass. Others came out of pure curiosity to see if the legends were true. Jon greeted them courteously, though each time a spark of wariness lingered. He remembered how quickly strangers could become foes, how easily alliances frayed when tested by fear or greed. But most left Winterfell with a sense of awe, telling stories of how they had glimpsed Hracker perched upon a tower at dusk, the setting sun refracting through its crystalline scales in a display that defied mortal words. They spoke of King Jon, a quiet man whose presence was anchored by a deep sense of duty and compassion and who ruled in partnership with a woman from the south, Daenerys Stormborn, when their realm's interests coincided. Whispers even circulated that their union, should it ever come to formal marriage, might yield heirs who were part Stark, part Targaryen, with the power of both wolf and dragon in their veins. For now, Jon set aside such speculation. He walked the path of leadership as best he could, day by day, always returning to the reflection that the realm was fragile and that vigilance was the price of peace. He often stole moments in the godwood, laying a hand on the heart tree's face, breathing in the damp scent of pine and earth. Sometimes he felt the old god's quiet acceptance of him, a man who was once a bastard, then a crow, then a king, and somehow all of those things in one. If they judged him for the secrets of his birth, they gave no sign. He felt only a calm presence, timeless and vast, reminding him that he was but one thread in a tapestry that spanned millennia. Bran, meanwhile, lingered at Winterfell, immersed in his roles as seer and keeper of memories. He rarely spoke of his visions now. Perhaps the conflict beyond the wall had sated his need to peer into the darkest corners of fate. Or perhaps he simply chose to focus on the present. Arya, upon returning again, listened to the stories of the expedition with quiet intensity. She said little, only that she was glad Tormund and Davos had made it back alive. She came and went like a wandering spirit, never staying too long in one place, though her presence always brought light to her siblings' eyes. She had her own path, one shaped by curiosity and wanderlust beyond Westeros's shores. And so time passed and the realm continued to heal. Crops flourished, roads were cleared, and the memory of the long night began to dim in some minds. But not Jon's. He kept the old warnings alive, ensuring watchers remained at Castle Black, forging alliances with the scattered free folk to the north, seeing to it that dragonglass reserves never ran low. He did not seek war or conflict, but neither did he allow complacency. The realm needed guardians, not conquerors. Daenerys understood this as well, and in her southern seat of power, she reigned with a tempered approach, mindful that her dragons were weapons best kept sheathed unless absolutely necessary. Occasionally, southern lords questioned the independence of the north. Why should one region be set apart, they asked. Jon's answer was always the same: the north was unique, vast, and aligned with powers older than men's kingdoms. Its traditions were deeply rooted in the old gods and the long winters. But more importantly, it had proven capable of defending the entire realm when the dire threats came. In time, most accepted this logic, or at least grudgingly tolerated it, if only because the memory of the war still burned in their minds. A few disgruntled nobles grumbled about the Dragon King of the North, but they were reminded that Jon had never sought to conquer them, he only protected his own. Over the months, tensions eased, replaced by an uneasy respect. Summer nights in Winterfell turned warm, though seldom hot. Sometimes a gentle rain swept in from the west, pattering on the castle's rooftops. Under the cover of darkness, Jon found peace strolling the ramparts, listening to the sound of distant frogs or the rustle of animals in the fields. He would pause by Hracker's roost, running a hand along the dragon's scaled hide, feeling the cold that still radiated there even in the midst of summer. The contradictory nature of it, a beast of winter thriving in a season of warmth, reminded him of his own duality, the fire of Targaryen lineage and the ice of Stark heritage. Together, somehow, they had forged a new path. One late summer evening, as he gazed at the moonlit expanse beyond Winterfell's walls, Daenerys returned unexpectedly, flying in on Drogon with a small honor guard. Jon hurried to the courtyard to greet her, curiosity piqued by her sudden arrival. She dismounted, handing the reins to a nervous stable hand, and embraced Jon with obvious relief in her eyes. "We've quashed another revolt in the Westerlands," she explained. "Minor lords trying to stoke old fears about Targaryen tyranny. It's settled now, but I realized I didn't want to stay in King's Landing. Not tonight." She looked up at the towers of Winterfell, at the flicker of torches along the walls. I needed to be somewhere that still feels like home. Jon's heart softened at her words. He offered a warm smile. You're always welcome here. You know that. They walked together through the courtyard, crossing the soft glow of moonlight. Drogon and Hracker exchanged cautious glances from opposite ends of the yard, each dragon acknowledging the other's presence but making no move to fight. Ghost padded alongside them, occasionally glancing up as if seeking reassurance that all was well. Daenerys asked after Sansa, Bran, and the rest, listening intently as Jon recounted the North's recent developments. Good harvests, new trade deals, and the shaping of a more unified defense structure. At last, they ended up on the ramparts, leaning against the cold stone battlement. The moon shone brightly, casting silver outlines on their faces. Daenerys took a moment to remove her gloves, letting her hands rest on the stone, as though testing the chill. It's peaceful here, she murmured. I remember how I once saw winter as an enemy. Now I see it differently. Perhaps it's your influence. He turned to her, noticing the warmth in her gaze. Winter can be harsh, but it's also the season that reminds us how precious life is, how we need each other to survive. Without winter, we'd never appreciate the spring. She nodded slowly, her hair lifting in the gentle breeze. You've changed, Jon. I sense a calm about you now, even after everything. Or perhaps because of it. He considered that, then shrugged lightly. I've learned that fear and anger only carry you so far. We faced the end of the world twice in some sense, and we overcame it. Now, I just want to protect what we've built, to give people a chance to live in peace. She smiled, stepping closer. And you will. I see that. The realm is fortunate to have you as the king in the north. And she paused, searching his eyes. I'm fortunate too. A quiet moment passed, charged with unspoken emotions. Beyond the walls, the low rumble of Hracker's breath mingled with Drogon's occasional growl. A reminder that though peace had come, the realm still harbored formidable powers. Here on the ramparts, king and queen stood side by side, fire and ice in fragile harmony. Jon reached out, took her hand in his, and let the warmth of that simple touch speak the words neither of them needed to say aloud. They had survived so much. They would face whatever came next together, or at least as allies bound by respect, by compassion, and by the understanding of what it meant to carry the weight of destiny. Below them, in the courtyard, a stable boy led Drogon to a resting place, while Hracker unfurled its massive wings and took flight, sweeping upward into the star-littered sky. Jon and Daenerys turned their faces skyward, watching as the ice dragon soared gracefully under the moon's pale glow. The image stirred something profound in Jon's chest. A sense of completion, a recognition that the North no longer stood alone in the darkness. Should any threat arise again, be it from man, monster, or magic, Westeros would not be caught unawares. They had their guardians, their alliances, and their hard-won unity. And so the night passed, gentle and unhurried, a far cry from the stormy battles of the past. Dawn brought a new day, bright and filled with promise. Servants bustled about with morning chores, guards changed shifts, and the sweet scent of baking bread drifted from the kitchens. In the great hall, Sansa greeted Daenerys with measured courtesy, but a hint of genuine affection warmed her voice. Tyrion, yawning, emerged from the library, already juggling half a dozen letters from various southern lords. Grey Worm and the Unsullied stood disciplined as ever, quietly integrated into Winterfell's new normal. Though the threat beyond the wall had been quelled and the memory of the Night King was slowly fading from common folks' minds, Jon remained vigilant. He gathered the northern lords for monthly councils, ensuring that if rumors of dark magic or unnatural storms ever surfaced again, they would address them swiftly. He encouraged Sam to compile a new record of recent events, not as a boastful saga but as a sober reminder that the realm must never forget the cost of ignoring threats from the far north. Sam, delighted, poured himself into the work, determined to keep the knowledge safe for future generations. Seasons continued to turn. Summer lingered in the north longer than usual, a welcome respite after the seemingly endless winter. Fields turned golden with wheat, herds of cattle grazed peacefully, and new villages took shape where old battle scars had once marred the land. Children grew up hearing stories of how the ice dragon fought alongside King Jon to vanquish the armies of the dead, how Queen Daenerys brought her fire-breathing children to defend the realm. In these stories, House Stark and House Targaryen were no longer adversaries but partners in an epic tale of survival. Whenever Wanderlust struck Jon, he would mount a horse and ride to the edges of his domain, sometimes with Ghost trotting beside him, sometimes alone. He would visit the old hill overlooking the shivering sea or the lonely fields where the dire wolves once roamed. If Hracker happened to be near, the dragon might shadow him from above, a silent companion whose presence always brought a sense of awe. Now and then, Jon would even mount Hracker, though carefully and only for short flights. The first time he tried, the experience left him both exhilarated and numb with cold, for sitting astride an ice dragon was a far cry from any normal mount. But each time, the bond between man and beast deepened. Hracker trusted him, and that trust was precious. Sometimes on those solitary rides, Jon found himself thinking of Ned Stark, the man who raised him with quiet honor and never told him of his true lineage. Jon did not resent it. He understood that love and duty were rarely simple. He silently thanked Ned for teaching him the values that shaped him into a king worthy of the North's loyalty. He thought, too, of Rhaegar Targaryen, the father he never knew, whose blood had granted him the potential to ride a dragon. It was a paradox that might have broken a lesser man, but Jon found purpose in it. He was both a Stark and a Targaryen, shaped by the stories of each but bound by neither entirely. On one such day, as he stood on a bluff overlooking a glittering river, Hracker landed beside him in a swirl of mist. The dragon's enormous head turned, ice-blue eyes regarding Jon with a calm intelligence. Jon chuckled softly, reaching out to rest a hand on the dragon's muzzle, feeling the familiar sting of cold. "You still amaze me, you know," Jon murmured. "When I found that egg beneath Winterfell, I had no idea what it would lead to." Hracker let out a puff of frosty breath, stirring Jon's cloak. In that simple exchange, Jon felt again the weight and wonder of everything that had happened. He had walked through death, defied ancient evils, and somehow emerged still carrying hope. Down by the river, a herd of wild deer grazed, oblivious or indifferent to the man and dragon on the bluff. The sky was a sharp, endless blue, unbroken by storms. Jon breathed in the clean air, tasting freedom on the wind. He had responsibilities, of course he did, but at that moment it felt right to simply exist side by side with a being once thought impossible in a realm that had survived apocalyptic threats to enjoy another day of sunlight. Before returning to Winterfell, he took one last, lingering look at the horizon. For as long as he drew breath, he would stand guard over the land he called home. And should darkness ever rise again, be it from the cold wastes beyond the wall, from the intrigues of southern courts, or from the deep places of the earth, Jon Snow, the king in the north, would meet it. He would gather old allies and new, stand in unity with dragon and dire wolf, and protect the world that deserved the chance to grow and flourish. Perhaps that was the true meaning of the Song of Ice and Fire, not merely a prophecy of doom and salvation, but the knowledge that in the balance of two opposing forces, life found a way to endure. And so, under a sky lit by a sun that felt warmer than it had in years, the ice dragon spread its wings. Jon climbed onto its back, steadying himself, and together they soared into the air. The land stretched out below them, dappled by sunlight and shadow, the harsh lines of winter softened by the gentle brush of summer. In that breathtaking flight, Jon felt neither fear nor regret, only a deep, abiding sense of belonging. He was the blood of the dragon, the son of the wolf, and the North's chosen king. In Hracker's roar, he heard an echo of his own voice, both a warning to any who threatened the peace and a tribute to all those who had fought to make it possible. High above the rivers and forests, beyond the battlements of Winterfell, their story continued, an unbroken tale of courage and loyalty, forged in the darkest winter and carried forward on the wings of a dragon shaped by ice, guided by a heart tempered in both fire and snow. And in every beat of those mighty wings, in every swirl of frost-laced wind, the promise resounded: so long as they remained vigilant, hope would stand eternal, and the North would never bow to the cold darkness again.